Martha Wren's hand shot out and grabbed the auctioneer's wrist so hard the man gasped, his gavel frozen in midair. "Don't you dare sell her to the glue man!" She said, her voice cracking like a whip across the stunned crowd. "That horse carries my father's brand. My father, who has been dead 40 years. The whole square went silent. Every laughing mouth snapped shut, because the mare everyone had mocked her for buying wasn't just blind and dying. She was proof that a dead man's killer was still walking free in Bitterroot country. If a story like this moves something in you, hit subscribe and stay with me all the way to the last word, and drop the name of the town you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. The dust hadn't even settled from the last bidding war when Martha Wren stepped up to the rail, and half the men in Caldwell Flats turned to look at her like she'd walked into the wrong church. "That's the widow Wren," someone muttered behind a gloved hand. "What in God's name is she doing at a horse sale?" Martha heard it. She heard most things people said about her, low and mean, thinking a 62-year-old woman in a faded blue dress couldn't catch a whisper, carried on dry Montana wind. She'd learned a long time ago that hearing wasn't the hard part. The hard part was not answering. She kept her eyes on the pen, the auctioneer. A heavy-set man named Otis Bell, with a mustache stained yellow from tobacco, was already moving down the line toward the last animal of the day, a sway-backed, hollow-eyed mare standing crooked in the corner of the pen, her coat caked in dried mud, one back leg trembling like it might give out any second. Flies crawled along her lashes. She didn't so much as twitch to shoo them. "Last one, folks," Bell called out, not bothering to hide the disgust in his voice. "Blind in both eyes, lame in the hind leg. This here mare's about one bad night from the knacker's wagon. I'll take whatever bid gets her off my hands before sundown." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "Give her to the dogs, Otis." "Save your breath, ain't nobody buying that bag of bones." Martha's jaw tightened. She stepped closer to the rail, close enough that the mare's ruined face turned slightly toward the sound of her boots' ears, swiveling, searching. $1, Martha said. The laughter died into confused murmurs. Otis Bell squinted at her like he hadn't heard right. "Ma'am, you said whatever bid gets her off your hands. I've got $1. Martha reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a single crumpled bill, holding it up for the whole square to see. Her hand did not shake, though her heart was hammering so hard she was sure the men nearest her could hear it. A rancher named Dale Pruitt let out a bark of laughter. "You gone soft in the head, Martha? That horse ain't worth the rope to lead her home. She'll be dead by morning." "Then she'll be dead in my barn instead of yours," Martha said. "Either way, it cost you nothing." Somebody whistled low. A few chuckled. Otis Bell looked at the sorry animal, looked at the sky already going orange at the edges, and shrugged like a man who'd rather be rid of a problem than argue with a fool. "$1's a dollar," he said, and slapped his gavel down. "Sold. To the widow Wren for the price of a loaf of bread." More laughter. Someone clapped slow and mocking. Martha didn't flinch. She'd buried a husband, buried 2 brothers to the war, buried a father whose grave she'd never even gotten to dig. She'd long since stopped flinching at anything men found funny. She walked around the rail past the snickering ranchers and let herself into the pen. The mare's ears pinned back at first, head jerking away from the unfamiliar smell. But Martha didn't reach for her. She just stood there, hands loose at her sides, and spoke low. "Easy now. Easy. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." It took a long moment. The mare's nostrils flared, tasting the air, and slowly, so slowly the crowd behind Martha had already lost interest and turned back to their own business. The animal's head dipped just an inch, just enough to let Martha's fingers brush along her jaw. That was when Martha saw it. High on the mare's left shoulder, half hidden beneath a filthy matted patch of hair, was a brand. Old. Scarred over so many years, the edges had softened into the hide like a scar healed crooked. Martha's whole body went still. She knew that mark. She had seen it 1,000 times, as a girl burned into fence posts, stamped into the corner of ledger pages, carved once with a pocket knife, into the wood of her own bedroom windowsill, by a man who used to lift her onto his shoulders and call her his best girl. A circle split by a single slashing line with a small W tucked beneath it. Her father's brand. Samuel Wren's brand. A man who had ridden into the Bitterroot Mountains 40 years ago to check on a herd and never once ridden back out. Martha's fingers curled against the mare's neck. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't hear the shouting and dealing still going on behind her, couldn't feel the wind or the dust or anything at all except the rough raised shape of that old brand under her palm. "That's not possible," she whispered. The mare shifted, favoring her bad leg, and let out a low groan of discomfort that snapped Martha back into her body. She swallowed hard, throat tight, and looked again closer this time, tracing the shape with 2 fingers to be sure her eyes and her grief weren't playing some cruel trick on her. They weren't. It was her father's mark. Unmistakable. Burned into the shoulder of a blind, dying mare that had by all appearances simply shown up at auction with no name, no history, no papers, sold off by a trader who claimed he'd bought her off a drifter passing through 2 counties over. "Ma'am," Otis Bell's voice cut through her thoughts. He was standing at the gate, arms crossed, clearly wanting to close up for the day. "You want help getting her to your wagon, or are you just going to stand there talking to her?" Martha straightened. Whatever had cracked open inside her chest, she folded it shut, the way she'd folded, shut so many things over the years. Grief, anger, the particular loneliness of being a woman alone on land, men assumed she couldn't hold on to. "I'll manage," she said. It took nearly 20 minutes to coax the mare into a slow, halting walk toward Martha's wagon, the animal stumbling twice, her ruined eyes rolling white with fear, at sounds she couldn't place. Martha kept one hand on her the whole way, murmuring steady, the way she used to talk to spooked colts on her father's ranch back, before the world took everything from her one piece at a time. "There now," she said, as the mare finally shakily climbed into the flatbed. "There now, girl. Nobody's laughing at you where we're going." The ride back to her small spread-outside town was quiet, except for the creak of wagon wheels and the mare's uneven breathing. Martha kept glancing over her shoulder at that brand, half convinced each time that she'd imagined it, that grief and exhaustion had conjured her father's mark out of an old meaningless scar. But every time she looked, it was there. Undeniable. By the time she reached her barn, the sun had dropped low and orange behind the ridge, and her hands were trembling, not from the effort of the day, but from something far deeper, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. She led the mare into the empty stall beside her one remaining plow horse, laid down fresh straw, with hands that wouldn't quite steady, and stood in the dim light, staring at that brand until her eyes burned. "Who are you?" she whispered, "and how in God's name did you end up wearing my father's mark?" The mare turned her blind eyes toward the sound of Martha's voice, ears pricked, as if she understood the question was for her, as if in some way an animal couldn't possibly explain. She already knew the answer mattered more than either of them yet realized. Martha didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a single oil lamp burning low, an old cigar box in front of her that she hadn't opened in over a decade. Her fingers hovered over the lid before she finally lifted it, and inside, yellowed with age, sat the few things she had left of her father. A pocket watch that no longer ticked a folded letter from the War Office confirming nothing except that he was presumed lost in mountain terrain, and a single tintype photograph of a broad-shouldered man standing beside a young horse, his hand resting proud on its shoulder, the same shoulder where that same brand had been freshly burned. Martha traced the edge of the photograph with her thumb. 40 years, she murmured. 40 years and not one word, not one grave, not one answer. She thought of her mother, dead now 8 years herself, who used to sit at this same table some nights and simply stare out the window toward the mountains, never crying, never explaining, just watching like she was waiting on something that never came. Martha had always assumed her mother was waiting on grief to finally arrive and settle for good. Now she wondered if her mother had been waiting on something else entirely. She closed the cigar box, pressed her palm flat against the lid, and made a decision that had been building in her chest since the moment she'd touched that brand in the auction pen. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, to no one, to the empty kitchen, to the ghost of a father she'd never gotten to bury. "Tomorrow, I find out how a dead man's horse ended up standing in a sail pen in Caldwell Flats. Morning came gray and cool mist, still clinging to the low fields when Martha walked out to the barn before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. The mare was standing at the front of her stall, head-low ribs showing sharp beneath her matted coat, but her ears turned the second Martha's boots hit the dirt floor. "Morning," Martha said softly. "Reckon you didn't sleep much better than I did." She set to work with a bucket of warm water and an old rag, gently working the dirt and grime from the mare's coat, careful around the brand, like she might rub away the one piece of truth she had left. As the layers of dust came away, more of the horse's history began to show a healed scar along her flank that looked like rope-burn hooves, cracked and neglected, but not naturally deformed, the kind of wear that came from years of hard, careless use rather than breeding. "Somebody worked you near to death," Martha murmured, "and then just as soon as your eyes gave out, tossed you off like an old boot." The mare pressed her nose into Martha's shoulder, and something in that simple, trusting gesture undid the last of Martha's composure. She stood there in the dim barn light, with her forehead resting against the horse's neck, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry, not for the mare, though the animal's suffering was real enough, but for a father whose absence had shaped every hard year of her life since she was 22 years old. "I named you already, you know," she said, wiping her face with the back of her wrist. "Ash, on account of that gray coat of yours once we get it clean." She pulled back, looking into those clouded, sightless eyes. "But I think maybe you've got a different name folks used to call you. And I aim to find out what it is." By mid-morning, Martha had hitched her plow horse and was on her way into town, leaving Ash resting in a stall full of fresh hay. Caldwell Flats wasn't a large place, one main street. A mercantile, a saloon that did more business than the church, and a land office that had in recent years become the busiest building on the block for reasons Martha had never much cared to ask about. She went first to the mercantile where Walt Dorsey stood behind the counter, sorting through a crate of nails. "Martha," he said, surprised. "Don't often see you in town twice in 1 week. I need to ask you something, Walt, about the horse trader who sold off that mare at yesterday's auction. Man wasn't from around here, was he?" Walt scratched at his jaw. "Can't say I know him well. Comes through maybe twice a year, buys up culled stock cheap from ranches out past Split Rock, sells whatever's left standing. Name's Ezra Combs, I believe." Martha's chest tightened at the mention of Split Rock. It was a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in decades, not since she was a girl when her father used to talk about riding fence lines out that way back before the mountains swallowed him whole. "Split Rock Creek," she repeated slowly. "That's still ranch land out there." Walt's expression shifted just slightly, a flicker of something Martha had learned over 62 years of reading people to recognize as caution. "Used to be smaller outfits out that way years back," he said, voice dropping a notch. "Most all of it's been bought up now. Belongs to the Crowder Ranch these days. Has for a long while." "Crowder," Martha said. The name settled in her stomach like a stone. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. Silas Crowder knew it, the way folks knew to keep their voices down in church, the way they knew not to ask too many questions about how a single ranch had come to swallow up half the valley in the span of 20 years. "You be careful asking around about that land, Martha," Walt said quietly, leaning forward over the counter. "Man's got more eyes and ears in this town than the sheriff does." Martha thanked him and stepped back out into the street, her mind spinning. A blind mare wearing her father's 40-year-old brand had come off land now owned by the most powerful and most feared rancher in the territory. That was no coincidence. Martha had lived long enough, buried enough people, and swallowed enough silence to know that some truths didn't arrive by accident. They arrived because they'd finally found a crack wide enough to climb through. She stood in the middle of Caldwell Flats' dusty main street, the morning sun now fully risen and hot against her shoulders, and felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in 40 years. Not grief, not loneliness, but purpose. "All right, Samuel Wren," she whispered under her breath, as if her father could somehow hear her across whatever distance separated the living from the dead. "Whatever happened to you out there, I aim to find out, and I aim to make whoever did it answer for it." She turned back toward her wagon, Her steps quicker now, more certain than they'd been in years, and she did not once look back at the men still laughing about the fool widow who'd wasted a whole dollar on a dying horse. Let them laugh. She had a brand to trace, a mountain to climb, and a father's 40-year silence to finally break. By the time Martha reached home that evening, Ash was waiting at the stall door, ears pricked toward the sound of the wagon, and Martha felt for the first time since her husband's funeral something close to not being alone. "We've got work ahead of us, girl," she said, unhitching the plow horse with steady hands. "Come morning, we start looking for Split Rock Creek." Inside the house, before she banked the fire and turned in for the night, Martha pulled her mother's old trunk out from beneath the bed, a trunk she hadn't opened since the funeral, full of folded quilts and yellowed letters she'd never had the heart to read. Tonight she opened it without hesitation, working past the quilts, past a stack of unopened correspondence, until her fingers brushed against something stiff and folded at the very bottom, tucked inside the lining like it had been hidden there on purpose. A map. Old, creased, the ink faded, but still legible, marked in her father's own hand. And at the center of it, circled twice the words, "Split Rock Creek, tell no one." Martha sat back on her heels, the map trembling in her hands, and understood at last that her mother hadn't spent all those years simply waiting on grief. She'd been keeping a secret. And now, 40 years too late, that secret had finally found its way home, carried on the back of a blind, dying mare that no one else in town had wanted. Martha didn't sleep past 4 that morning. She sat at the kitchen table with the map spread flat under the lamp, her father's handwriting bleeding faint and gray across the paper, and she traced the marked trail with one finger until she had it memorized well enough to close her eyes and still see it. Split Rock Creek, tell no one. She said the words out loud, testing them like maybe saying them enough times would strip away whatever fear was making her hands shake. "Tell no one," she repeated. "Well, Samuel, I don't rightly know who's left to tell." By the time the sun cracked over the ridge, she'd already fed Ash, packed a saddlebag with jerky, a canteen, a box of matches, and her late husband's old revolver, a weapon she hadn't touched since the day she buried him, its weight unfamiliar and cold in her palm. She stood in the barn doorway a long moment, staring at the gun like it belonged to a stranger. "Don't reckon I'll need you," she muttered. "But I ain't walking into Crowderland unarmed either." She saddled her plow horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Duke, because Ash was in no shape yet to carry a rider. Her legs were still too weak, her body still healing from whatever cruelty had put those rope scars on her flank. But Martha didn't leave her behind entirely. She stood at the stall, pressed her forehead to the mare's, and made a promise she intended to keep. "I'll come back for you," she said. "Once I know what I'm walking into. I ain't leaving you here forever, girl. I promise you that." The mare huffed against her collar, and Martha could have sworn foolish, as it sounded even in her own head, that the animal understood. The ride out to Split Rock Creek took the better part of 3 hours, winding up through scrub pine and loose shale, the trail growing narrower and rougher the higher she climbed. Martha kept the map folded against her chest, checking it every quarter mile against landmarks that had barely changed in 40 years. A lightning-split boulder her father used to call the old preacher a bend in the creek shaped like a fishhook. She was so focused on the trail that she almost didn't hear the second set of hoofbeats until they were nearly on top of her. "Morning, ma'am!" Martha's whole body went rigid. She turned in the saddle to find a rider approaching from the tree line, young, maybe 30, dressed in a clean coat that marked him as hired help rather than a rancher himself, a rifle slung casual across his saddle horn in a way that wasn't casual at all. "Morning," she said, keeping her voice even. "This here's Crowderland, ma'am. Private. You lost?" "Just riding," Martha said. "Didn't realize the whole mountain belonged to one man." The rider's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Mr. Crowder owns most everything from the creek to the ridgeline. Has for years. Wouldn't want you getting turned around out here. Terrain's rougher than it looks." "I appreciate the concern," Martha said, and turned Duke's head back toward the trail she'd come up, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the man could hear it. "I'll head on back down then." She rode a quarter mile in a direction she had no intention of keeping, waited until the trees swallowed her from view, and then cut hard west off the main trail deeper into the brush, where no rider on Crowder's payroll would think to look for a 62-year-old widow on a plow horse. Her hands were shaking on the reins. "He was watching," she whispered to herself. "That whole trail, he was watching for exactly somebody like me." It took another hour of careful bramble-torn riding before Martha found a shallow depression in the rock, half hidden behind a curtain of dead brush, exactly where her father's map had marked an X with the word shelter scrawled beside it in ink gone the color of rust. She dismounted, tied Duke to a scrub pine, and pushed through the brush with her heart in her throat. The camp was small, 40 years abandoned, but sheltered enough by the rock overhang that some of it had survived a collapsed lean-to, a rusted coffee pot, half buried in dirt, and driven into the rock face itself, a rotted wooden box wedged into a crevice, like someone had shoved it there in a hurry and never come back. Martha knelt in front of it, hands trembling so badly she could barely work the rusted latch. When it finally gave the hinges shrieking with 4 decades of neglect, she found herself staring down at yellowed papers. A leather-bound ledger swollen with old moisture, and tucked beneath it all, a folded letter with her name written on the outside in her father's unmistakable hand. Martha. She pressed her palm flat over the letter and did not open it. Not yet. Her whole body had gone cold, and some part of her, the part that had spent 40 years learning how to survive. Disappointment was afraid that whatever was inside would break something in her that she wouldn't be able to put back together out here, alone on a mountain that belonged to a man everyone was too frightened to name out loud. "Not yet," she said to no one. "Not out here." She was reaching to close the box when a voice cut through the trees behind her, low and hard. "You're a long way from town, ma'am." Martha spun one hand instinctively going to the revolver at her hip, and found herself staring at a man she didn't recognize, older, maybe 70, with a weathered face and eyes that studied her, not with menace, but with something closer to shock. "Who are you?" Martha demanded, though her voice cracked on the last word. The old man's eyes dropped to the open box at her feet, to the letter in her hand, and something in his face crumbled. "That handwriting," he said quietly. "God Almighty, that's Samuel's hand." Martha's breath caught. "You knew my father. You're his girl," the old man said, not a question. "You've got his eyes. I'd know them anywhere." He lowered himself carefully onto a flat rock like his legs had suddenly gone weak beneath him. "Name's Ezra Combs. I reckon it was me who sold you that mare." Martha stood frozen, the letter still clutched in her hand, staring at the man who'd sold her the blind horse only 2 days prior. "You?" she said slowly. "You're the one who had Ash." "Didn't know her name till just now," Ezra said. "But yes, ma'am. Bought her off a Crowder foreman 2 months back, cheap on account of her going blind. Didn't think twice about it. Just another old, worked-out mare heading to auction." He shook his head, staring at the letter in Martha's hand, like it was a ghost he'd been expecting his whole life. Had no earthly idea whose brand she was carrying. Not till right now. "How did you know my father?" Ezra was quiet a long moment, his jaw working like the words had been buried so deep he had to dig for them. "Samuel Wren and I rode fence together back before Crowder bought up half this valley," he said finally. "Good man. Honest to a fault, which out here, ma'am, can get a man killed faster than being a thief." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet. "I always figured he'd just wandered off and died somewhere in these mountains. Snakebite, maybe, or a bad fall. Never once let myself think—" He stopped. "Think what?" Martha pressed, stepping closer. "Ezra. Think what?" "There were rumors," he said quietly. 40 years back. Rumors that Samuel had found something he wasn't supposed to find. Papers. Land deeds that didn't add up right. Folks said he was fixing to ride into town and take it to the federal land office. Ezra's voice dropped lower still. "And then he just never came back down off this mountain. Nobody ever found a body. Nobody ever asked too hard. Either. Not with Silas Crowder's father running things back then, and not with Silas himself running things now." Martha's knees nearly buckled. She lowered herself onto the rock beside Ezra, the unopened letter trembling in her grip. "You're saying somebody killed him," she said, "because of what he found out here." "I ain't saying anything for certain," Ezra said carefully. "I'm an old man who sold a blind horse for grocery money, ma'am, not a lawman. But I'll tell you this." He nodded toward the box at her feet. "Whatever's in there, you'd best read it somewhere safer than open mountain air on Crowder land. Man's got riders combing these hills near every week. I don't know what for exactly, but it ain't for pleasure." As if summoned by the words themselves, a distant sound rolled down through the trees. Hoofbeats, more than one rider moving fast. Ezra went pale. "That'll be them." "Who are?" "Get down," Ezra hissed, grabbing Martha's arm and pulling her low behind the rock overhang. "And for God's sake, ma'am, don't say a word." Martha crouched with the box clutched to her chest, her pulse slamming so hard against her ribs she was sure it would give them away. Through a gap in the brush, she watched 3 riders crest the ridge above the camp rifles, slung moving with the unhurried confidence of men who owned every inch of ground beneath them. "Anything?" one of them called out, voice carrying easy across the thin mountain air. "Nothing yet," another answered. "Boss said check the old camp again. Said somebody's been asking around town about Split Rock." Martha's blood went to ice. Somebody had already talked. Word had already reached Crowder from where she couldn't guess, but it didn't much matter. What mattered was that a man with an army of riders and 40 years of buried secrets now knew that someone was digging where he'd spent 4 decades making sure no one dug. "Boss is real particular about that old camp," the first rider said. "Says burn it if we find it. Says there ain't supposed to be nothing left up here at all." Martha's hand tightened around the box until her knuckles ached. Beside her, Ezra's breathing had gone shallow and fast. He was an old man unarmed, and Martha understood with sudden terrible clarity that if those riders found them here, there would be no explaining their way out of it. Not with her father's ledger in her hands. Not with a letter addressed to her in a dead man's writing. The riders' voices faded as they moved along the ridge, but they didn't leave. She could still hear them moving in a slow, methodical arc that would eventually bring them straight down into the very hollow where she and Ezra were hidden. "We can't stay here," Ezra whispered. "Where do we go?" Martha whispered back. And for the first time since she'd stepped into that auction pen with a single crumpled dollar, real fear cracked through her voice. Ezra's eyes darted along the tree line, and Martha watched him calculate the way a man who'd survived a hard life learned to calculate, weighing every bad option against every worse one. "There's a deer trail," he breathed. "Runs east along the creek bed out past the rock slide. Rough going, but it'll keep us below their sight line." He looked at her hard. "You up for it, ma'am? Because I ain't got the legs I used to, and I can't carry you if you fall." Martha thought of her father's letter pressed against her chest. Thought of Ash standing blind and trusting in her barn, waiting on a promise Martha had every intention of keeping. "I'm up for it," she said. They moved low and fast along the creek bed, boots sinking into wet gravel, the sound of the water masking their footsteps, but also masking, Martha realized with rising dread, the sound of anyone who might be closing in from behind. Every 20 feet, she glanced back over her shoulder, certain she'd see a rider break through the tree line with a rifle already raised. "How much further?" she gasped, her lungs burning in a way they hadn't in years. "Rock slides just past that bend," Ezra said. "Once we're through it, there's a gulch that'll hide us clean till we reach the horses." They rounded the bend, and Martha's stomach dropped. The rock slide Ezra remembered had shifted sometime in the years since he'd last walked this trail. A fresh scattering of loose shale now covered the path, unstable and steep, dropping off sharply toward the creek below. "Ezra," Martha said, staring at the treacherous slope. "That doesn't look like it's held anybody's weight in a long while." "It's the only way," Ezra said grimly. "Unless you'd rather take your chances with the men carrying rifles." Somewhere behind them, faint but unmistakable, a voice called out, "Hey, tracks over here, fresh ones!" Martha's blood turned to ice water. "They found the trail." "Go," Ezra said, shoving her forward. "Go now and don't look back." Martha scrambled onto the loose shale, the box clutched under one arm, her boots sliding with every step, rocks skittering down toward the creek in loud echoing cascades that she was certain would carry straight to the rider's ears. Behind her, Ezra followed slower, his older legs struggling against the shifting ground. Halfway across a rock gave beneath Martha's boot, and she pitched forward with a sharp cry, catching herself hard on one knee, pain lancing up through her leg. The box slipped from her grip and skidded 3 feet down the slope before wedging against a boulder. "Martha." Ezra's voice sharp with fear. "I'm all right," she gasped, though her knee was screaming and her palms were torn raw against the shale. She lunged for the box fingers closing around the rotted wood just as another shout rang out from the ridge above. "There, I see 'em down by the creek." A rifle shot cracked through the mountain air. Martha didn't think. She grabbed the box, scrambled the last stretch of rock slide on hands and knees, and half fell into the gulch beyond, just as a second shot ricocheted off stone, somewhere far too close for comfort. "Move!" Ezra bellowed, half sliding, half falling down behind her. "Don't stop, don't look back, just move!" They ran. The gulch cut a jagged, twisting path down through the rock, narrow enough in places that Martha had to turn sideways to fit through her breath, tearing ragged in her chest, her injured knee screaming with every step. Behind them, the shouts of the riders grew fainter, swallowed by rock and distance. But neither of them dared to slow down to be certain they'd truly lost them. It was nearly 20 minutes before Ezra finally staggered to a halt, hand braced against the rock wall, chest heaving. "I think," he gasped, "I think we've lost them. For now." Martha collapsed against the opposite wall, the box hugged tight to her chest, her whole body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion and a fear so deep it had settled into her bones. "They shot at us," she said, voice shaking. "Ezra, they shot at us." "They did," Ezra said grimly. "And they'll keep shooting, ma'am, if they ever get wind of what's in that box you're holding." He looked at her, his weathered face lined with something between admiration and terror. "You understand now, don't you? What your father stumbled onto. What he died for." Martha looked down at the rotted wooden box at the letter still tucked safe inside her coat, and felt something harden in her chest that hadn't been there 24 hours before. "I understand that men just tried to kill us over papers 40 years old," she said, "which means whatever's in here is worth more to Crowder alive and buried than it ever was to my father dead. So what do you aim to do?" Ezra asked quietly. Martha straightened, ignoring the throb in her knee, ignoring the tremor still running through her hands, and looked back up the gulch toward the mountain they'd just fled. "I aim to read every word my father left me," she said, "and then I aim to make sure the whole territory knows exactly what Silas Crowder's been hiding up here for 40 years. They didn't dare take the main trail back. Ezra led her along a longer, rougher path that skirted the edge of Crowder land, entirely adding nearly 2 hours to the journey. But by the time they reached the spot where Martha had left Duke tied to the scrub pine, the sun had dropped low enough to paint the whole valley gold, and neither of them had spoken more than a handful of words the entire way. "You'll want to get that knee looked at," Ezra said, watching Martha wince as she mounted. "I'll manage." Martha said, echoing the same words she'd said to Otis Bell 2 days before, though this time they carried a different weight entirely. "Martha?" Ezra caught her rein before she could turn Duke toward home. His face had gone serious in a way that made Martha's stomach tighten. "You be careful who you trust with what's in that box. Crowder's got friends in places you wouldn't expect. The sheriff, the land office, even some folks who smile at you every Sunday at church." He held her gaze. 40 years, ma'am. That's a long time for a man to build walls around a secret. He won't let one old woman and a blind horse tear them down without a fight." Martha thought of the riders on the ridge, the rifle shots cracking off stone, the cold certainty in that foreman's voice burn it. "Boss says there ain't supposed to be nothing left up here at all." "Let him fight then," she said. "I've buried a husband, 2 brothers, and now I know I've buried a murdered father. I'm not scared of Silas Crowder." "Maybe you should be." Ezra said quietly. Just a little. Martha didn't answer that. She nodded once, thanked him for his help, and turned Duke down the long trail toward home, the wooden box wedged carefully into her saddlebag, her father's letter pressed against her heart, the entire ride back. It was full dark by the time she reached her small spread, and Ash was waiting at the stall door the moment Martha's boots hit the barn floor, ears swiveling toward the familiar sound. "I told you I'd come back," Martha murmured, running a hand along the mare's neck, though her voice cracked with exhaustion and something rawer underneath it. Turns out coming back was a mite harder than I figured. She fed both horses, checked Duke's legs for injury, and finally allowed herself to walk into the house bar, the door behind her, something she hadn't done in years, and sit down at the kitchen table with the box and the letter laid out in front of her. For a long moment, she simply stared at her own name, written in her father's hand. Martha. 4 letters that undid something in her chest she'd spent 40 years carefully holding together. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. My dearest Martha, if you are reading this, then I have failed to make it home, and I am sorrier for that than for anything else in this life. I write this not knowing if these words will ever reach you, but I could not ride down off this mountain without setting the truth down somewhere in case the worst should come to pass. I have found evidence, Martha, of a fraud so deep and so old it has swallowed half this valley whole. Land that belonged to honest ranching families, the Hendersons, the Ruiz family. Old Thomas Whitfield has been quietly stolen through forged deeds and falsified county records. The true owners run off, or worse, their land absorbed into a single growing empire. I have the proof. Ledgers. Signatures forged so carelessly a blind man could see the fraud. And I know now who is behind it. Silas Crowder's father began it, but Silas has continued, it expanded it, and I fear grown far more dangerous in the doing. I am going to try to reach the federal land office in the next county before anyone learns what I know. If I do not make it know that I did not simply wander off and die, whatever story might reach your ears, know that your father loved you and your mother more than his own life, and that he would not have risked that love lightly. Trust no one in Caldwell Flats who wears Crowder's favor. And should this letter ever find its way to you, finish what I could not. Your loving father, Samuel Wren. Martha sat frozen long after she finished reading the letter, trembling in hands gone numb, tears tracking silent down a face that had gone hard with grief and something fiercer than grief. 40 years. 40 years of silence, of her mother staring out that same kitchen window toward the mountains, of Martha herself, believing her father had simply been swallowed up by wild country and bad luck. He had been murdered, silenced, and the man responsible had spent 4 decades growing richer and more powerful on land, stolen from families just like her own. She set the letter down with great care, opened the ledger beneath it, and began page by careful page to understand the true size of what her father had uncovered. The ledger was worse than she'd imagined. Page after page, in her father's meticulous hand, documented parcel after parcel of stolen land dates, forged signatures compared side by side against verified ones, the discrepancies glaring even to Martha's untrained eye. Names she recognized from her childhood. The Hendersons, who'd once run cattle on the eastern range before disappearing from the valley entirely when Martha was still a girl. The Ruiz family, whose youngest daughter had been Martha's own playmate before they vanished one winter, their land absorbed so quietly into Crowder Holdings that nobody had thought to ask questions. Old Thomas Whitfield, who Martha now remembered vaguely painfully, had been found dead at the bottom of a ravine the same year her father disappeared. His death ruled an unfortunate accident by a coroner, who Martha now suspected had likely never once questioned who signed his paycheck. She worked through the night cross-referencing her father's notes against what little she could recall of the valley's history. And by the time gray dawn light began creeping through her kitchen window, she had filled 3 pages of her own with names, dates, and a growing, sickening certainty. This wasn't simply theft. This was a decades-long campaign of murder dressed up as accident and disappearance, each death clearing the way for one more forged deed, one more parcel of stolen land folded quietly into an empire that no one in Caldwell Flats had ever dared to question. Martha rubbed her burning eyes and looked up to find Ash's blind gaze somehow fixed in her direction through the open barn door across the yard, as if the old mare had sensed even from that distance the shift in the woman who'd rescued her. "Your last owner didn't just work you to death, did he, girl?" Martha murmured. "You came off Crowder land. You're a piece of evidence he never even knew he sold off at auction." The thought settled cold and clear in Martha's chest. That brand, that blind dying mare that no one else had wanted. It hadn't been coincidence at all. It had been the thread that finally, after 40 years, unraveled the whole rotten tapestry. She barely slept 2 hours before a hard knock rattled her front door, jolting her upright at the kitchen table, the ledger still spread open in front of her. Her heart lurched into her throat as she scrambled to gather the papers, shoving them beneath a loose floorboard she'd pried up years ago to hide her husband's old revolver before she finally crossed the room and opened the door a cautious few inches. Sheriff Dale Whitcomb stood on her porch, hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately set Martha's nerves on edge. "Morning, Mrs. Wren," he said. "Sorry to trouble you so early." "Sheriff," Martha said carefully. "Something the matter. Had a report of some trouble up on Crowder land yesterday," Whitcomb said, his eyes flicking past her into the house, though Martha kept the door mostly closed against his view. "Couple of Mr. Crowder's men said they spotted trespassers near an old line camp out by Split Rock Creek. Said one of 'em might have been a woman." Martha's pulse hammered, but she kept her face still, her voice steadier than she felt. "That's so. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, ma'am?" "I spent yesterday tending to a sick horse," Martha said. "Bought her at auction 2 days back. Poor thing's been keeping me plenty busy right here at home." Whitcomb studied her a long moment, and Martha forced herself not to look away, not to give him one single reason to doubt her. "Funny thing," he said finally. "Mr. Crowder seemed awful particular about it. Asked me personal to come check around town, see if anybody'd heard talk about that old camp." He settled his hat back on his head. "You haven't heard any such talk, have you, Mrs. Wren?" "Can't say I have, Sheriff." He nodded slowly, though something in his eyes told Martha he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, you let me know if you do. Mr. Crowder don't take kindly to folks poking around his property." "I'll keep that in mind," Martha said. The moment his horse cleared the yard, Martha shut the door, threw the bar across it, and sank back against the wood, her whole body shaking. He knew. Or if he didn't know for certain, he suspected, and that suspicion had traveled fast enough to put the sheriff himself on her porch within a single day. "Ezra was right," she whispered to the empty house. "He's got eyes everywhere." She waited 3 days before she dared return to Ezra Combs's small cabin at the edge of town, choosing a route that wound wide around the main road, her nerves stretched thin the entire ride. When she finally knocked on his door, he opened it, a mere crack, eyes darting past her shoulder before he pulled her quickly inside. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, bolting the door behind her. "Not in daylight, not on that horse everybody in town recognizes." "I need help, Ezra," Martha said. "I've read the ledger, the letter. I know what my father found. I know what happened to the Hendersons, the Ruiz family, old Thomas Whitfield." She pulled the folded pages from inside her coat, her own careful notes copied out in case anything happened to the originals. "But knowing isn't enough. I need someone who can help me prove it. Someone the whole valley will believe, because God knows they won't believe a lone widow with a stack of 40-year-old papers." Ezra was quiet a long moment, staring at the pages in her hand like they might catch fire. "There's a man," he said finally. "Used to be Crowder's own bookkeeper years back before he had some kind of falling out with the family and left the valley entirely. Name's Franklin Reyes. Last I heard he was living 2 counties over running a small accounting office. If anybody still living understands Crowder's finances well enough to make sense of these numbers, then he's the one who can help me prove it in a courtroom. Martha finished. If he's willing, Ezra said grimly, and if we can reach him before Crowder realizes what you're building. Martha folded the papers carefully back into her coat, her jaw set with a determination that had been building in her chest since the moment she'd first touched that scarred brand on Ash's shoulder. Then we'd best not waste any more time, she said. The ride to Franklin Reyes's town took the better part of 2 days, Martha traveling under the thin cover story that she was visiting a cousin, though the lie sat uneasy in her stomach the whole journey. She left Ash in the care of a young neighbor girl she trusted with strict instructions and a small sum of money, and rode out with Ezra at first light, both of them watching the road behind them more than the road ahead. They found Franklin Reyes in a small office above a mercantile, a thin, nervous man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and eyes that widened with something close to fear the moment Ezra explained who they were and what they carried. Samuel Wren's daughter, Reyes said quietly, staring at Martha like she'd stepped out of a memory he'd spent decades trying to bury. I wondered sometimes if anyone would ever come asking. You knew my father. I knew of him, Reyes said. I was young when I worked for Crowder's father, barely more than a boy keeping books I didn't fully understand were crooked until it was far too late to walk away clean. He looked at the ledger Martha set carefully on his desk, and his hands trembled as he reached for it. I left the valley the year your father disappeared. Told myself it was coincidence. Told myself a lot of things over the years to sleep at night. He spent the better part of 2 hours poring over the ledger cross-referencing figures against memories he clearly wished he didn't still carry, his face growing paler with every page. This is real, he said, finally looking up at Martha with something like awe and dread mingled together. This isn't speculation, Mrs. Wren. This is a documented decades-long pattern of forged deeds and falsified county filings. And if what you're telling me about these deaths is accurate, it's accurate, Martha said firmly. Then you're not just holding evidence of land fraud, Reyes said quietly. You're holding evidence of murder, multiple murders. And the man responsible for all of it is still sitting on that land today, more powerful than he's ever been. I know, Martha said. That's why I need your help. You understand these numbers in ways no judge or lawyer in Caldwell Flats ever could. I need you to help me build this into something no one can laugh off or bury. Reyes was quiet a long moment, staring down at the papers at 40 years of carefully documented theft and death laid bare on his desk. It'll be dangerous, he said finally. For all of us. Crowder didn't survive this long by allowing loose ends to simply walk away. I've already had men shooting at me over these papers, Martha said. I don't intend to stop now. Something in her voice, steady, unshaken, forged in 40 years of quiet grief, finally given a place to go, seemed to settle whatever fear had been holding Reyes back. All right, Mrs. Wren, he said, extending a trembling hand. Let's finish what your father started. They worked through the night in Reyes's small office, the three of them building a case document by document. Reyes organizing the financial fraud into a clear, damning timeline. Ezra recalling names and dates from memory that filled gaps the ledger alone couldn't explain. Martha writing everything out in careful duplicate copies, determined that no single fire or theft could ever again erase her father's 40-year silence. It was nearing midnight when a sharp knock at the office door below sent all three of them freezing in place. You expecting anyone? Martha whispered. Reyes shook his head, his face draining of color. Nobody knows I'm even in town tonight except the two of you. The knock came again, harder. Ezra crossed silently to the window, peering down through a gap in the curtain, and when he turned back to face them, his expression had gone grim as stone. Martha, he said quietly, there's 2 men down there, and I recognize one of them from the ridge at Split Rock Creek. Martha's blood ran cold. They followed us, she breathed. Or they've been watching this office for longer than we realized, Reyes said, already sweeping papers into a leather satchel with shaking hands. There's a back stair. Goes down into the alley behind the mercantile. It's our only chance. Another knock louder, now followed by a voice Martha recognized, instantly smooth cold, carrying an authority that had clearly never once been questioned. "Mr. Reyes," the voice called up through the door. "We know you're in there. Mr. Crowder would very much like a word." Martha's heart slammed against her ribs. Silas Crowder himself hadn't come. But his voice, carried through a hired man standing on the other side of that door, made it unmistakably clear that the empire her father had died trying to expose had already found them and had no intention of letting the truth walk out of that office alive. Reyes's satchel slipped from his fingers, papers spilling half onto the floor before Martha caught them, her hands moving faster than her fear. "The stairs!" Ezra hissed. "Now!" Downstairs, the door handle rattled, then a heavier thud, a shoulder against wood. "Mr. Reyes," the voice called again, patient in a way that made Martha's skin crawl. "No need to make this difficult." Reyes was already moving, sweeping the last of the loose pages into the satchel, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his pen twice. Martha grabbed his wrist. "Breathe," she said low and hard. "Panic gets us caught. Move quiet, move quick." Something in her voice steadied him. He nodded once, swallowed, and led them toward the narrow back stair tucked behind a curtain by the filing cabinets. The door downstairs cracked, not broken yet, but close. "Go," Ezra whispered, shoving Martha toward the stairs. She went first, one hand on the satchel, the other braced against the wall in the dark, her bad knee screaming with every step. Behind her, Reyes stumbled once, caught himself, and Ezra brought up the rear, glancing back over his shoulder toward the office they'd just abandoned. They reached the bottom just as they heard the front door give way above them with a splintering crack. "Reyes!" the voice bellowed, now all patience gone. "You're only making this worse for yourself." Martha pushed open the back door into the alley. Cold night air hitting her face, and for one terrible second, she thought she saw a shadow move at the alley's far end. A third man posted exactly where a smart operation would post one. "There's someone out there," she breathed. "Where's your horses?" Reyes whispered. "Livery 2 streets over," Ezra said. "We'll never make it there without being seen." Martha's mind raced. She thought of her father's letter trust, no one who wears Crowder's favor, thought of the ledger, now clutched against Reyes's chest, thought of Ash standing blind and trusting in a stranger's care. 2 days' ride from here, and something in her chest hardened into pure cold resolve. "Then we don't go to the livery," she said. "We split up. Ezra, you and Mr. Reyes take the papers out through the church lot. Pastor Coombs owes me a favor. He'll hide you in the cellar till first light. I'll draw them the other way." "Martha, no," Ezra started. "I'm an old woman. Nobody's afraid of—" Martha cut him off. "That's my advantage, and I intend to use it. Go, now while there's still time." She didn't wait for his argument. She pressed the satchel firmer into Reyes's shaking hands, turned on her heel, and walked straight out into the open alley. Not running, not hiding. Just an old widow in a faded coat, walking like she had every right in the world to be there. The shadow at the alley's end shifted toward her. "Evening," Martha said before he could speak, her voice carrying loud enough to draw his full attention. "You wouldn't happen to know where a body finds a decent cup of coffee this time of night? Can't sleep a wink, and my nephew's office upstairs keeps the lamp burning something fierce." The man hesitated clearly, not expecting an old woman rambling about coffee, and in that half-second of confusion, Martha heard faint but unmistakable the soft scuff of 2 sets of footsteps disappearing in the opposite direction toward the church. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be out here alone," the man said, finally stepping closer, his hand resting a shade too casual near his hip. "Nowhere's safe for the woman alone these days." "Is it?" Martha said, and let herself sound frightened. Let her voice tremble the way it wanted to anyway. "I'll just head home then. Sorry to trouble you." She turned and walked slow and unhurried back the way she'd come, every nerve in her body screaming to run, every instinct fighting the discipline it took to keep her pace steady until she rounded the corner out of his sight. Only then did she run. She found the church cellar door exactly where she remembered it from a christening 2 years back, and rapped 3 times, soft and quick, the signal she and Ezra had agreed on in the seconds before they split. The door cracked open, Ezra's pale face peering out. "Thank God," he breathed, pulling her inside and barring the door behind her. Reyes sat on an overturned crate in the dim light of a single candle, the satchel clutched to his chest, like it was the last solid thing in the world. "They didn't see you?" he asked. "They saw an old fool asking about coffee," Martha said, sinking down onto a crate of her own, her legs finally giving out beneath her now that the danger had passed. Man wasn't looking for anybody quite so unthreatening. "That was reckless," Ezra said, though there was something like awe beneath the scold in his voice. "That was the only thing I had," Martha said. She looked at Reyes. "The ledger. Is it safe?" "Safe," Reyes confirmed. "But Martha, they knew I was in that office tonight. They knew within hours of us starting the work. Someone talked." The words settled cold in the small cellar. "Who else knew you were helping us?" Martha asked. Reyes's face went gray. "Nobody. I swear it. I told no one." He stopped himself, some memory catching in his throat. "The telegraph clerk. I sent a wire to my sister 2 towns over letting her know I might be delayed coming home. I mentioned nothing of the ledger, nothing of names, but Crowder pays that clerk to report anything unusual," Ezra finished grimly. "A stranger sending late-night wires right after Samuel Wren's daughter comes asking after you." Martha closed her eyes. 40 years, and the man's reach still stretched into every corner of the territory. Every clerk, every sheriff, every frightened neighbor too afraid to ask the wrong question out loud. "Then we can't stay in any one place long enough for word to travel," she said. Opening her eyes, something fierce and steady settling back into her spine. "We finish building this case fast, and we take it somewhere Crowder's money can't reach straight to the federal land office the way my father tried to 40 years ago." "And if they catch us before we get there?" Reyes asked quietly. Martha thought of the rifle shots on the rock slide of the man in the alley, with his hand resting too casual near his hip, of a father who'd asked the same question once and never gotten a chance to answer it. "Then we make sure the truth doesn't die with us," she said. "Copies, Mr. Reyes. Tonight before we sleep, we make copies of everything, and we send them by 3 separate routes to 3 separate people we trust. If Crowder wants to silence the truth this time, he'll have to catch it running in 4 directions at once." They worked by candlelight until nearly dawn, Reyes's steady hand copying figures while Martha transcribed her father's letter word for word, Ezra keeping watch at the small cellar window, tension coiled tight in every line of his aging body. By the time gray light crept through the cracks in the church door, they had 4 full sets of the case, the original, and 3 careful copies, each one sealed and addressed. One would go with Reyes himself, carried personally to the federal land office in the next territory. One Ezra would carry to an old army friend, a retired judge now living 2 counties south, a man Crowder's money had never managed to reach. One would go by trusted courier to a newspaper editor in the capital, a woman known for printing stories. Other papers were too frightened to touch, and the last Martha decided she would keep on her own person, carried against her body every waking hour, because she had learned in one terrifying night just how quickly a man like Crowder could make evidence disappear. "You should go home," Ezra told her as the sun climbed fully over the horizon. "Lay low. Let us carry this the rest of the way." Martha shook her head. "I started this the moment I put my hand on that mare's shoulder. I'll see it through." "Martha." Ezra's voice was gentle but firm. "You've a horse waiting on you back in Caldwell Flats and a target on your back the size of this whole territory. Going home isn't hiding. It's finishing what needs finishing on your end, showing your face in town like nothing's changed, so nobody thinks to look twice at where the real evidence has gone." It took her a long moment, but she saw the sense in it. A grieving old widow seen going about her ordinary business drew far less suspicion than one who vanished from town entirely. "All right," she said finally. "I'll go home. But the moment that evidence reaches safe hands, you send word. However you can. I've waited 40 years for this truth. I don't intend to wait one day longer than I have to for justice." The ride back to Caldwell Flats took 2 full days. Martha choosing back roads and old trails, doubling back twice when she thought she heard hoofbeats behind her that turned out to be nothing but wind through dry grass and her own exhausted imagination running wild. By the time her own barn came into view, her whole body ached with a bone-deep weariness she hadn't felt since burying her husband. Ash was waiting as always, ears pricked toward the sound of Duke's hooves the moment they turned into the yard, and Martha felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of the mare's blind, trusting face turned toward her. "Missed you too, girl," she murmured, sliding down from the saddle with a groan she couldn't quite hide. The young neighbor girl who'd tended the horses in her absence reported nothing unusual. No strange riders, no questions asked around town. And for one brief evening, Martha allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they had slipped past Crowder's reach cleanly. That illusion lasted exactly until the following morning, when she walked into the mercantile for supplies and found the whole store gone unnaturally quiet the moment she stepped through the door. Walt Dorsey wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "Martha," he said, voice low, "you'd best hear this from a friend before you hear it elsewhere. Sheriff's been asking around town quiet-like, but asking about where you got off to these last few days. And there's a rumor going around that Mr. Crowder's put a bounty out. Not on you by name, mind, but on anybody caught carrying stolen papers off his land." Martha's stomach dropped, but she kept her face carefully still. "Rumors are cheap, Walt. This one's got teeth," Walt said quietly. "Man came through yesterday, stranger asking real specific questions about a widow woman and an old horse trader, offering good money for information." He finally looked up, and his eyes were scared. "You be careful, Martha. Whatever you've stepped into, it's bigger than this town's ever seen." She was 3 steps out the mercantile door when a hand closed hard around her arm. Martha spun, heart lurching into her throat, and found herself face to face with a man she'd never seen before, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in a way that marked him as more than hired muscle, his smile thin and cold as winter creek water. "Mrs. Wren," he said pleasantly, though his grip on her arm didn't loosen. "Mr. Crowder would be grateful for a moment of your time." "I don't believe we've been introduced," Martha said, keeping her voice level, despite the fear clawing up her throat. "Cyrus Vane," the man said. "I manage certain matters for Mr. Crowder, and I believe you and I have quite a lot to discuss." He steered her firm, but not quite rough enough to draw attention on the busy street toward a waiting carriage, fine black entirely out of place among the dusty wagons of Caldwell Flats. Martha's mind raced through every option, every escape, and found none that didn't risk her life right there in broad daylight. "I'd rather discuss whatever this is right here," Martha said, planting her feet. "In town, where folks can see." Vane's smile didn't waver. "Mr. Crowder simply wishes to clear up a misunderstanding, Mrs. Wren. Nothing more. Surely an innocent woman has nothing to fear from a short conversation." The word innocent hung in the air between them like a blade. Martha climbed into the carriage. Silas Crowder was not what Martha expected. She'd built him in her mind over the past week as something monstrous twisted by 40 years of hidden violence into a shape barely human. But the man who sat waiting for her in the fine parlor of the Crowder ranch house was simply old 70, maybe older. Silver-haired, dressed in a plain but expensive suit, his hands folded calm on his lap like a man entirely at peace with himself. "Mrs. Wren," he said, rising, as she entered, his voice smooth and cultured in a way that made her skin crawl. "Please, sit." "I'll stand," Martha said. Crowder's mouth curved not quite a smile. "As you wish." He settled back into his chair, studying her with eyes that gave away nothing. "I understand you've been asking questions about some old land records, about a mare you purchased recently at auction. I understand a great many people have been shot at, threatened, and followed on your orders," Martha said, refusing to soften her voice, despite every instinct screaming caution. "I understand my father rode up into these mountains 40 years ago and never rode back down, and I understand now precisely why." Something flickered behind Crowder's calm eyes, not guilt, Martha realized with a chill. Irritation. the look of a man mildly inconvenienced by a problem he'd assumed long buried. "Your father," Crowder said slowly, "was a stubborn man who couldn't accept that some land disputes are simply the cost of progress in a growing territory. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Wren, truly. But I fear you've built quite a fantastical story around an old man's unfortunate accident." "Accident," Martha repeated. "The same kind of accident that befell Thomas Whitfield. The same kind that made the Hendersons and the Ruiz family simply vanish from land they'd worked for generations." Crowder's expression cooled several degrees. "You've been listening to old gossip, Mrs. Wren. Mountain country breeds wild stories. I'd advise you to be careful which ones you choose to repeat, particularly ones that might be construed as slanderous." "I'm not repeating gossip," Martha said, and despite the fear hammering through her chest, her voice came out steady, hard as flint. "I'm holding a ledger in my father's own hand. Forged deeds compared line by line against the real ones. 40 years of documented theft. Mr. Crowder and I intend to see every page of it read aloud in a federal courtroom." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Martha could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears. Crowder rose slowly from his chair, crossed to the window, and stood with his back to her. Hands clasped behind him, staring out over land that Martha now understood had been built entirely on other families' blood. "You remind me of him, you know," Crowder said quietly. "Your father. That same foolish, stubborn belief that truth alone is enough to move the world." He turned back to face her, and whatever mask of civility he'd worn moments before had slipped, revealing something colder underneath. "It wasn't enough for him, Mrs. Wren. And it won't be enough for you." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Crowder said. "I've built something here that this territory needs. Jobs, cattle, commerce that feeds half the families in 3 counties. Whatever mistakes were made 40 years ago in the building of it, and I'll not confirm nor deny what those mistakes might have been. That's ancient history, now buried deep enough that no court in this territory would ever risk unearthing it." "You're wrong," Martha said. "Because I already have. And copies of everything are already on their way to people your money can't touch." For the first time, something like genuine alarm cracked through Crowder's composure. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Am I?" Martha met his eyes without flinching. 40 years of grief and fear, burning away into something harder, colder, more certain than she'd ever felt in her life. "You had men shoot at me on that mountain, Mr. Crowder. You had riders track a bookkeeper's office in the dead of night. You've spent 4 decades making sure nobody dug deep enough to find the truth. Well, congratulations. Somebody finally did, and no amount of money or threats is going to unring that bell." Crowder studied her for a long, terrible moment, and Martha watched something shift behind his eyes. Calculation replacing anger, the cold arithmetic of a man deciding just how far he was willing to go to protect 4 decades of buried sin. "You should go home, Mrs. Wren," he said finally, his voice gone quiet and dangerous. "Tend to your horse. Live out whatever years you have left in peace. I'd hate to see anything unfortunate happen to a grieving widow who simply doesn't know when to stop digging." "Is that a threat too?" "It's advice," Crowder said. "Freely given. The last and only kindness I intend to offer you." Vane drove her back to town in stony silence, and the moment the carriage rolled to a stop outside the Mercantile, Martha climbed down without a word and walked straight to her wagon, her legs shaking so badly she nearly stumbled twice. She didn't feel safe again until she was well outside town, the dusty road empty behind her. Duke's steady gait the only sound beside her own ragged breathing. "He as good as confessed," she said aloud to no one, her hands white-knuckled on the reins. 40 years, and he as good as confessed it to my face." But confession whispered in a private parlor meant nothing in a court of law. She needed the ledger heard aloud, needed Reyes and Ezra and the judge and the newspaper editor to reach safety with their copies before Crowder's men could silence them the way they'd silenced her father. She was 3 miles from home when she heard at hoofbeats several riders moving fast and closing distance behind her. Martha's heart lurched. She snapped the reins, urging Duke into a run. He wasn't built for the old plow horse, straining valiantly against a pace meant for younger, leaner animals. Behind her, the hoofbeats grew louder closer, and a voice rang out across the open road. "Mrs. Wren, pull up!" She didn't. She drove Duke harder, the wagon rattling violently over ruts and stone. Her father's letter and her own copied notes clutched tight against her chest with one white-knuckled hand. A rider drew alongside close enough that Martha could see the rifle slung across his saddle, close enough to reach out and grab her reins if he chose. "Mrs. Wren, I said pull up!" he shouted, and something in his voice, not menace but urgency, made Martha risk a glance sideways. It wasn't one of Crowder's men. It was Sheriff Dale Whitcomb, his own horse lathered with effort. 3 deputies close behind him, and his face carried none of the careful neutrality he'd worn on her porch days before. "Sheriff!" Martha gasped, easing back on the reins despite every instinct screaming to keep running. "Pull up, ma'am, please," Whitcomb said, drawing his horse alongside hers as Duke finally slowed to a walk. "I need to talk to you, now, before Crowder's men catch wind of where you're headed." Martha's heart hammered with fresh terror. "You're one of his men." "I was," Whitcomb said, and something in his weathered face had gone grim and ashamed. "For 15 years I looked the other way on things I shouldn't have told myself it wasn't my business how a powerful man conducted his affairs." He met her eyes, and there was real fear there, now, real urgency. "But my deputy found something this morning, Mrs. Wren. A telegraph meant for Crowder's eyes only, that came through the office by mistake. Orders. Regarding a bookkeeper named Reyes, and an old horse trader named Combs, and a widow woman he wants stopped before she reaches the territorial capital." Martha's blood ran cold. "Stopped how?" Whitcomb's jaw tightened. "However's necessary." "Those were the words, ma'am. However's necessary." The road blurred for a moment as fear and fury collided in Martha's chest. "Then we don't have much time," she said. "No, ma'am." Whitcomb agreed. "We don't. Which is why I'm asking you to trust me when I know you've got every reason not to. I mean to do right by this finally, however late it's come. But I need to know everything you know right now on this road, before Crowder's men reach whoever's carrying that evidence first." Martha studied the sheriff's face for a long, searching moment. 15 years of complicit silence weighed against the raw fear and shame now written plain across his features, and made a decision that terrified her more than the ride from Split Rock Creek ever had. "All right, Sheriff," she said. "But if you betray me, I promise you God is my witness the whole territory will know your name alongside Crowder's when this is over." "Understood," Whitcomb said grimly. "Now tell me everything. Fast. We're already behind." Tang. They rode hard for the church at the edge of town. Whitcomb and his deputies flanking Martha's wagon the entire way, and by the time they reached Pastor Coombs's small cellar, Martha's heart had climbed so far into her throat she could barely force words past it. The cellar was empty. "They're gone," Martha breathed, spinning to face Whitcomb, panic clawing up through her chest. "Ezra and Reyes, they left for the capital 2 days ago. They should still be on the southern road." "Southern road," Whitcomb repeated, already turning back toward his horse. That telegraph mentioned men posted along the southern crossing, waiting on a bookkeeper matching Reyes's description. Martha's stomach dropped straight through the cellar floor. "How far to the crossing?" 6 miles hard riding," Whitcomb said, already swinging up into his saddle. "Mrs. Wren, you should stay here. Let us." "I'm not staying anywhere," Martha snapped, already climbing back up onto her own wagon seat, despite her aching knee, despite the bone-deep exhaustion of the past week, finally catching up to every inch of her body. "That's my father's evidence riding into an ambush. I'm not sitting safe in a church cellar while good men pay for what I started." Whitcomb studied her a moment, then nodded, some grudging respect breaking through his fear. "Then keep up if you can, ma'am. We ride now."
Yeah.
The 6 miles to the southern crossing passed in a blur of pounding hooves and rattling wagon wheels, Martha's whole body screaming with exhaustion, her mind consumed with a single desperate prayer that they wouldn't arrive too late. They heard the gunfire before they saw the crossing. Sharp cracks echoing off the hills, followed by shouting, followed by a scream that made Martha's blood run to ice. "Ezra!" she gasped. Whitcomb spurred his horse harder, deputies fanning out beside him, and Martha followed as close as Duke's exhausted legs could manage, cresting the final rise, just in time to see the scene unfold below. Ezra Combs was down clutching his shoulder, blood soaking dark through his coat sleeve, while Reyes stood pressed against an overturned wagon, the satchel clutched desperately to his chest. Two of Crowder's men closing in with weapons drawn. "Sheriff's Department!" Whitcomb bellowed, drawing his own weapon as his deputies fanned out around him. "Drop your weapons now!" The two men spun startled weapons, swinging uncertainly between the approaching lawmen and their original targets. "This ain't your business, Sheriff," one of them called out, though his voice had lost considerable confidence at the sight of four armed deputies. "Mr. Crowder's orders." "Mr. Crowder's orders don't override the law." Whitcomb shot back, his voice carrying an authority Martha hadn't heard from him before. "Drop your weapons. Last warning." A long, tense moment stretched between them, and Martha held her breath, certain the whole confrontation would erupt into gunfire that would leave someone dead in the dust of that crossing. Then slowly, the first man lowered his rifle. The second followed, cursing under his breath, and Whitcomb's deputies moved in fast, disarming and restraining both men before they could reconsider. Martha was already off her wagon and running toward Ezra, ignoring the screaming protest of her injured knee, dropping to her knees in the dirt beside him. Ezra, look at me. Ezra, look at me. I'm all right?" Ezra gritted out, though his face had gone pale and sweaty blood still seeping steady through his fingers. "Winged me is all. Reyes—" His eyes cut past her urgent. "The ledger, Martha, is it?" "Safe," Reyes called out, still clutching the satchel, shaking so badly he could barely stand. "Safe, Ezra, we're safe." Martha pressed her hands hard against Ezra's wound, applying pressure, the way she'd learned tending her husband through his final illness years before, her voice steady even as tears burned hot behind her eyes. "You hold on," she told him fiercely. "You hear me, Ezra Combs? You did not survive 40 years of Crowder's silence just to bleed out on this road today. You hold on. Hold. Wouldn't dream of dying." Ezra managed a weak, pained smile flickering across his lips, and missing the look on that man's face when this all comes crashing down around him. They got Ezra back to town within the hour, Whitcomb's deputies riding hard escort the entire way, and the town doctor pronounced the wound serious, but not fatal, the bullet having passed clean through muscle without striking anything vital. Reyes, shaken but unharmed, sat in the corner of the doctor's small office, the satchel never once leaving his grip. Whitcomb found Martha in the hallway outside his face grave, his hat turning slow between restless hands. "Those two men are in my jail," he said quietly. "And they're talking Mrs. Wren. Scared enough of a murder charge to start naming names, giving up details about orders straight from Crowder himself." He met her eyes. "This is bigger than I ever let myself believe all these years. I'm ashamed of how long I looked away." "Then look toward it now," Martha said. "That's all that matters going forward." "I've already sent riders to the territorial marshal's office," Whitcomb said. "With what those two are confessing combined with your ledger and your father's letter, I believe we finally have enough to bring federal authorities into this valley. Real ones. Ones Crowder's money has never had the chance to reach." Martha closed her eyes briefly, 40 years of grief and fear, and finally, something that felt dangerously close to hope, all crashing together in her chest at once. "How long?" she asked. "Days, maybe?" Whitcomb said. "If we're fortunate. And if Crowder realizes his men have been taken, realizes what's coming." Whitcomb's face went grim. "Then we'd best pray we're faster than he is desperate." That night, alone in her own kitchen for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Martha sat with her father's letter spread once more before her, reading his words over and over by lamplight until she'd all but memorized every line. Trust no one who wears Crowder's favor. She thought of Sheriff Whitcomb, 15 years complicit, before finally choosing in one desperate moment on a dusty road to stand against the very power he'd sworn loyalty to for so long. She thought of Ezra bleeding in the dirt and still managing a smile. She thought of Rhea's hands shaking, but never once letting go of the satchel that held 40 years of buried truth. Trust was a fragile thing in a valley built on so much silence. But Martha understood now in a way she hadn't fully grasped when she'd first put her single crumpled dollar into Otis Bell's hand. That truth itself was fragile too, and it took ordinary frightened people finding the courage to carry it piece by piece, farther than any one person could carry it alone. She rose from the table, crossed to the barn in the cool dark of night, and stood beside Ash's stall, a long while resting her forehead against the mare's neck, breathing in the familiar warmth of an animal who had in her own small and unknowing way cracked open 40 years of buried history. "We're almost there, girl," Martha whispered. "Your brand, my father's letter, all of it finally coming together." She pulled back, looking into those clouded, sightless eyes that had somehow seen more truth than half the sighted men in this valley combined. "Whatever happens next, I need you to know you saved him. 40 years too late to save his life, maybe, but you saved his name." Somewhere out past the ridge, in a house built on stolen land and buried sins, Silas Crowder was undoubtedly already scrambling to contain a truth that had finally, after 4 decades, slipped entirely beyond his control. And Martha Wren, 62-years-old widow, daughter of a murdered man, stood in her own barn in the quiet dark, and felt for the first time since childhood that her father was somehow standing right there beside her, waiting at long last for the truth to finally come home. Word of the 2 captured men's confessions spread through Caldwell Flats faster than Martha could have imagined, faster even than Sheriff Whitcomb's riders could reach the territorial marshal's office. By the second morning, half the town seemed to know something had cracked open, even if none of them yet understood exactly what. Martha felt it the moment she stepped into the mercantile, the way conversations dropped half a notch when she entered the way eyes that used to slide past her now lingered curious, uncertain, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. "Martha." Walt Dorsey came around the counter faster than she'd ever seen him move his face, carrying none of its usual careful neutrality. "Is it true what they're saying about the sheriff's jail, about men confessing to working for Crowder?" "I can't say everything yet, Walt," Martha said carefully. "But yes, some of it's true." Walt's jaw worked, and for a moment Martha thought he might simply nod and let it go the way he'd let so many things go over the years, rather than risk Crowder's displeasure. Instead, he leaned across the counter, voice dropping low. "My wife's cousin," he said. "Family used to run cattle out past the eastern range years back. Just up and lost the land one winter. Papers all confused, and nobody in the family ever understood how it happened. They moved on, never talked about it again." His eyes were wet now, decades of buried grief surfacing all at once. Was that him too, Crowder? Martha thought of the ledger of pages she now knew by heart, names inked in her father's careful hand. "I don't know your wife's family name, Walt," she said gently. "But if it happened the way you're describing, I'd wager the answer is yes." Walt sat down hard on his stool behind the counter, one hand pressed to his mouth, and Martha understood in that moment just how deep and how wide the wound Crowder had carved into this valley truly ran. Not just her own father, not just the handful of names in the ledger, but families scattered across 40 years of quiet theft, each one believing their loss had been simple. Bad luck, never once suspecting the truth, had a name and an address just up the valley road. What? By that afternoon, Sheriff Whitcomb summoned her to his office, and Martha found him standing over a desk covered in papers, his face drawn tight with exhaustion and something that looked almost like fear. "Territorial marshals sent word," he said without preamble. "Federal Land Office is sending investigators. 3 days, maybe 4, depending on weather up in the pass." He looked up at her. "But Martha, word's already reaching Crowder, too. One of my own deputies let something slip at the saloon last night, drunk and careless. By now Crowder knows the marshal's coming." Martha's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means a cornered man does desperate things," Whitcomb said grimly. "Man spent 40 years building an empire on buried bodies." He's not simply going to sit in that big house and wait for federal investigators to come knocking. As if summoned by the words themselves, the office door burst open, and a young deputy stumbled in breathless, his face pale. "Sheriff, there's smoke out past the church, the pastor's cellar. Somebody said it?" Martha's blood turned to ice. Reyes, the copies. She was already running before Whitcomb could finish barking orders to his deputies, her bad knee screaming with every stride, her heart hammering with a terror sharper than anything she'd felt on that mountain rockslide days before. The smoke was visible from 2 streets away, thick and black, curling up from behind the small church where Ezra still lay, recovering from his gunshot wound, where Reyes had been keeping the last of the local copies safe. "No!" Martha gasped, pushing through a small gathering crowd. "No, no, no!" But when she rounded the corner, what she found stopped her cold. It wasn't the cellar burning. It was a small shed behind the church empty, but for old hymnals and broken pews, already collapsing in on itself, flames licking hungrily at dry, ancient wood. Reyes stood off to the side, satchel clutched tight against his chest, his face white with shock, but his hands steady around the leather strap. "Diversion," he breathed, meeting Martha's eyes as she stumbled to a halt beside him, gasping for air. "Had to be. They wanted us running towards smoke while—" He stopped, horror dawning fresh across his features. "While what?" Martha demanded. Reyes's eyes went wide. "While somebody searched the cellar." They ran together, Reyes's satchel banging against his hip, Martha's knee screaming in protest, and found the cellar door standing wide open. The small space inside, ransacked quilts thrown aside the loose floorboard where Ezra had hidden a second set of duplicate papers pried up and empty. "They got the second copy," Martha said, voice hollow with dread. "But not this one," Reyes said, tightening his grip on the satchel he'd never once let out of his sight. "And not the one Ezra insisted on mailing separately to the judge 2 counties south, before any of us even knew we were being watched this closely." Martha closed her eyes, forcing her breathing to slow, forcing the panic clawing up her throat back down into something she could use rather than something that would swallow her whole. "2 copies gone," she said. 2 remain, and a federal marshal 3 days out." She opened her eyes and found something hard and unshaken settling behind them. "We protect what's left, whatever it takes." That night, Whitcomb posted 2 deputies outside Martha's own small spread, an arrangement that left her feeling equal parts grateful and unsettled. Grateful for protection, unsettled by how thoroughly her quiet, ordinary life had transformed into something requiring armed guards at her door. She sat at her kitchen table long after the house had gone dark, the last remaining local copy of the case spread before her, and found herself not for the first time speaking softly to a father who could no longer answer. "You'd know what to do here," she murmured. "You always did have a steadier head than mine, even when I was young." She traced a finger along the edge of the ledger's worn cover. "But I reckon I've done all right so far. 40 years late, maybe. But I got this far." A soft knock at her door made her freeze, heart lurching, until a familiar voice called low through the wood. "Martha, it's me, Ezra." She opened the door to find him standing pale but upright, one arm still bound in a sling, a young deputy hovering anxious at his shoulder. "You shouldn't be out of bed," Martha scolded, pulling him inside regardless. "Couldn't rest," Ezra said, easing himself down into a chair with a wince. "Not with everything happening. Martha, I've been thinking on something all afternoon, and I need to say it before I lose my nerve." "Say it then." Ezra was quiet a moment, his weathered face working through something difficult. 40 years ago, I heard the rumors about your father, same as everyone else. Heard he'd found something dangerous, heard he never came back down off that mountain." He met her eyes, and his own were wet with old, buried shame. "I never once went looking for the truth of it. Told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself a man like Crowder's father wasn't somebody a small horse trader should cross." His voice cracked. "I've carried that shame near on half my life, Martha. Buying that mare at auction, selling her off without knowing what brand she carried, I think some part of God's hand was in that, giving an old coward one last chance to do right by a man he should have stood up for 4 decades sooner. Martha reached across the table and took his good hand in both of hers. "You're doing right by him now," she said. "That's what matters. 40 years of silence doesn't erase what you're risking today, Ezra. Bullet wound and all." Ezra managed a weak, watery smile. "Reckon we make quite a pair. An old coward and a fool widow finally too stubborn to stay quiet any longer." "Reckon we do," Martha agreed. And for the first time in days, something like warmth broke through the constant grinding fear that had gripped her since the moment she'd first touched that scarred brand. The federal marshal, a tall, unsmiling man named Grantham, arrived on the morning of the 4th day, accompanied by 2 land office investigators and a small contingent of soldiers. Martha hadn't expected, but found herself deeply grateful for the moment she saw the size of the crowd gathering in the street outside the sheriff's office. Word had spread through the whole valley by then. Not just Caldwell Flats, but the surrounding ranches and homesteads, families who'd heard whispers of stolen land finally being investigated. Families who'd spent decades believing their own losses had been simple misfortune rather than deliberate theft. They came in wagons and on horseback, dozens of them, then hundreds gathering in the street with faces Martha recognized from a childhood she'd nearly forgotten, faces belonging to families whose names appeared throughout her father's ledger. An older woman approached Martha outside the sheriff's office. Her hands twisted anxious in her apron, tears already tracking down a weathered face. "You're Samuel Wren's girl," the woman said. "I'm Ruth Henderson. My husband's family lost our eastern rangeland the same year your father disappeared." Her voice shook. "We always believed it was simply bad luck. Bad contracts, bad weather, bad timing, all piled together." She reached out, gripping Martha's hands with surprising strength. "Is it true what they're saying, that it was theft all along? That—" Martha looked into Ruth Henderson's tear-filled eyes, thought of her father's careful, damning handwriting, cataloging the Henderson name among dozens of others, and found she could no longer bear to soften the truth for anyone's comfort. "It's true," Martha said quietly. "I'm sorry it took 40 years for anyone to say so out loud." Ruth Henderson broke down entirely, then decades of quiet grief finally given permission to surface, and Martha held the stranger's trembling hands and felt more than ever the true weight of what her father had died trying to expose. Not simply her own family's 40-year wound, but a valley full of them stitched together by silence and fear into something that had allowed one man's greed to flourish unchecked for 2 full generations. Marshal Grantham set up a temporary office in the town hall, and for the better part of 2 days, Martha Reyes Ezra and Sheriff Whitcomb sat through exhaustive questioning, laying out every piece of evidence: the ledger, her father's letter, the forged deeds compared against verified originals, the confessions already extracted from the 2 men caught at the southern crossing. "This is extraordinarily thorough," Grantham admitted on the 2nd afternoon, studying Reyes's careful financial timeline with something approaching genuine respect. 40 years of documented fraud cross-referenced against county filings and death records. "I've rarely seen a case built this completely, and certainly never one assembled by civilians working against such active opposition. We had help," Martha said, thinking of every hand that had touched this case along its dangerous path. Ezra's memory, Reyes's expertise, Whitcomb's belated courage, even the young neighbor girl who'd tended Ash without ever knowing the true stakes of what Martha carried. "Well, Mrs. Wren, you should know," Grantham said, setting down the ledger with careful hands. "This is more than sufficient grounds for federal charges. Land fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and given the confessions already obtained regarding the ambush at the southern crossing, likely conspiracy to commit murder as well, both recent and historical." He met her eyes. "We'll need formal statements from everyone involved. And Mrs. Wren, I must ask, are you prepared for what comes next? Silas Crowder is not a man who will simply surrender quietly to a jail cell. Men like him rarely do." Martha thought of her father's letter of 40 years, spent believing he'd simply vanished into wild country, of a mother who'd stared out a kitchen window for decades without ever explaining why. "I've been prepared for this longer than you know, Marshal," she said. "Whatever comes next, I intend to see it through." That evening, as the Marshal's men made final preparations to ride out to the Crowder Ranch the following morning, word reached Martha through a breathless young deputy that changed everything. "Mrs. Wren Sheriff needs you at the jail quick as you can." Martha's heart lurched into fresh terror as she hurried through darkened streets, certain something catastrophic had befallen Ezra or Reyes, certain Crowder's Reach had somehow found one final desperate way to silence the truth before it could be formally recorded. Instead, she found Whitcomb standing in the jail's front office beside a woman Martha had never seen before. Elegant, well-dressed, her face pale, and drawn, her hands trembling as she clutched a small leather case against her chest. "Mrs. Wren," Whitcomb said, his voice carrying an odd note of shock. "This is Eleanor Crowder." Martha's breath caught. His wife was... Eleanor Crowder said quietly. "I've filed for legal separation this very afternoon through a lawyer I've been quietly retaining for the better part of a year." Her hands shook as she set the leather case down on Whitcomb's desk. "I've lived beside that man's silence for 35 years, Mrs. Wren. Told myself, same as everyone in this valley, that it wasn't my business to ask too many questions." Her eyes met Martha's, and there was real anguish there, real shame. "I overheard him 3 nights ago speaking with Cyrus Vane, discussing what to do about your evidence about your father's letter. I couldn't sleep after that. Couldn't eat. I've spent 35 years being a comfortable, willing kind of blind Mrs. Wren, and I find I simply cannot do it one day longer." She opened the leather case, revealing a stack of papers. Martha recognized instantly. Her father's own handwriting faded, but unmistakable, alongside additional documents Martha had never seen before. "What is this?" Martha breathed. "My husband kept a private safe in his study," Eleanor said. "I've known the combination for years, though I never once had the courage to open it before tonight. These are records he never expected anyone else to find. Correspondence with his own father from years before I ever married into this family, discussing how to handle what he called the Wren problem." Her voice cracked. "Mrs. Wren, I am so deeply sorry. I believe these papers will prove beyond any doubt that your father's death was not an accident, that it was ordered deliberately by my husband's own father, and that Silas himself carried out whatever was required to ensure the truth stayed buried." "Auntie..." Martha's knees nearly buckled. Whitcomb caught her elbow, steadying her, as she stared down at papers that represented the final, undeniable proof of everything she'd spent the past 2 weeks fighting to uncover. 40 years, Martha whispered. 40 years, and his own wife is the one who finally... I should have found the courage decades sooner. Eleanor said, tears finally spilling down her composed, elegant face. "I cannot undo 35 years of comfortable silence, Mrs. Wren. But I can make certain it ends tonight." Marshal Grantham reviewed Eleanor Crowder's evidence late into the night, and by dawn, the case against Silas Crowder had transformed from strong to utterly, irrefutably conclusive. Correspondence detailing the original scheme, financial records tracking decades of laundered profits from stolen land, and most damning of all, a letter in Crowder's own father's hand, written 39 years prior, explicitly ordering that the Wren situation be handled permanently and without trace. "This is enough to hang him," Grantham said grimly, reviewing the final document. "Or would be if territorial law still allowed it. As matters stand, Mrs. Wren, I believe we have more than sufficient grounds for the most severe charges available under federal jurisdiction." Martha sat in Whitcomb's office as the sun rose fully over the valley, exhaustion and vindication warring in equal measure through her trembling body, and felt something in her chest finally begin to loosen after 40 years of carrying grief she'd never fully understood the shape of. "When do you ride out to the ranch?" she asked. "This morning," Grantham said. "I'd advise you to remain in town, Mrs. Wren. Whatever satisfaction you might feel at seeing this through personally. Crowder is a desperate, cornered man now, and desperate men are dangerous." Martha thought of the rifle shots on the rock slide of Ezra, bleeding in the dirt of the southern crossing of 40 years, spent believing her father had simply vanished without explanation. "I've earned the right to see this through," she said quietly. "I'll not hide in town while the man responsible for my father's murder is finally brought to justice." Grantham studied her a long moment, then nodded, some grudging respect flickering behind his tired eyes. "Very well, Mrs. Wren. But you'll stay behind our line and you'll follow every order given without hesitation. Is that understood?" "Understood," Martha said. The ride out to the Crowder Ranch that morning carried none of the fear that had gripped Martha during her first desperate journey to Split Rock Creek. Instead, flanked by federal marshal's soldiers and Sheriff Whitcomb's own deputies, she rode with a steady, grim purpose that had been building in her chest since the moment she'd first touched that scarred brand on Ash's shoulder. They found the ranch house gates already standing open, and inside, chaos had clearly taken hold. Hired hands scattered at the sight of federal soldiers approaching, several dropping tools and simply walking away from the property, entirely unwilling to stand alongside a man whose empire was so visibly finally collapsing. Cyrus Vane met them on the porch, his earlier cold confidence replaced entirely by pale, sweating desperation. "Mr. Crowder isn't receiving visitors," he said, though his voice shook badly enough to undercut whatever authority he was attempting to project. "This isn't a social call," Grantham said, dismounting with brisk efficiency papers already in hand. "Silas Crowder, you're under federal arrest on charges of land fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and murder. Step aside." Vane's face went white. He glanced back toward the house, then at the soldiers surrounding him, and made the only calculation left available to a man whose loyalty had never run deeper than his paycheck. "He's in his study," Vane said quietly, stepping back from the door. They found Silas Crowder exactly where Vane had said, seated behind a heavy oak desk in a study lined with books Martha suspected he'd never once read, his composure remarkably intact, despite the soldiers now filling his doorway. "Marshal," Crowder said, rising slowly, his voice carrying the same smooth, cultured tone Martha remembered from their first meeting. "I trust there's some misunderstanding we can clear up." "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Crowder," Grantham said, laying out the warrant with clinical precision. "We have your father's written orders regarding Samuel Wren's murder. We have your own financial records documenting 40 years of land fraud. We have sworn confessions from 2 of your men regarding the ambush at the southern crossing. And we have your wife's testimony." Something in Crowder's face finally truly cracked at the mention of Eleanor. "She wouldn't," he said, though the certainty had drained entirely from his voice. "She already has," Martha said, stepping forward from behind the soldiers, unable to hold herself back any longer. 35 years of silence finally broken Mr. Crowder, same as mine. Crowder's eyes found her, and for the first time since their meeting in his parlor days, before Martha saw something beneath his careful composure that looked almost like fear. "Mrs. Wren," he said quietly, "I did warn you to let this rest." "You murdered my father," Martha said, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her ribs. "You let 2 innocent families lose everything they'd built. You had men shoot at me on a mountainside, and you had my friend's blood spilled on a dusty road, all to protect 40 years of stolen land and buried lies." She met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not the one who should have been afraid, Mr. Crowder. You should have been afraid of the truth this entire time." Grantham's men moved forward, and Crowder, recognizing at last the full and total collapse of everything he'd spent 4 decades building, offered no further resistance as the marshal's deputies placed him in irons. "This land," Crowder said, his voice suddenly uncharacteristically small as they led him toward the door. "This whole valley, I built something here. Something that outlasted my father. Something that fed families for generations. You built it on murder," Martha said. "And murder doesn't get to call itself a legacy, Mr. Crowder. Not anymore." Word of Silas Crowder's arrest swept through Caldwell Flats and the surrounding valley, faster than any news Martha had ever witnessed, faster even than the rumors that had first cracked open 2 days before. By that evening, the whole town had gathered in the street outside the sheriff's office, watching in stunned, disbelieving silence as federal soldiers escorted the most powerful man in the territory toward a waiting prison wagon, his empire dissolving visibly with every step. Ruth Henderson stood near the front of the crowd, tears streaming freely down her face, gripping the hand of a young granddaughter who would never fully understand the weight of what had been lost and finally partially restored. Ezra stood beside Martha, his arm still bound his weathered face, carrying an expression of profound exhausted relief. 40 years, he murmured. Reckon I never truly believed I'd live to see this day. None of us did, Martha said quietly. Watching as the wagon carrying Silas Crowder rolled slowly out of town, flanked by armed soldiers, the crowd parting silently to let it pass. Not until a blind mare wandered into an auction pen nobody else wanted to bid on. Reyes appeared at her other side, the satchel finally blessedly no longer needed for its dangerous burden. The land office investigators tell me restitution proceedings will begin within the month, he said. Every family documented in your father's ledger, the Hendersons, the Ruiz family, dozens of others, they'll have legal grounds to reclaim what was stolen from them. Martha closed her eyes briefly, 40 years of grief finally beginning at long last to find somewhere useful to go. He'd be glad of that, she said quietly. More glad of that, I think, than anything done on his own behalf. Sheriff Whitcomb found her later that evening standing alone at the edge of the crowd as it slowly dispersed the town, beginning the long, difficult process of absorbing 40 years of buried truth all at once. Marshal Grantham asked me to pass along his thanks, Whitcomb said. Said in 20 years of federal service, he's rarely seen a case built with such thoroughness under such dangerous circumstances. He hesitated, hat turning slow in his hands. I owe you an apology too, Mrs. Wren. 15 years of looking the other way, that's not something I can undo with one good ride to the Southern Crossing. You chose right when it mattered most, Martha said. That has to count for something. I hope so, Whitcomb said quietly. I truly hope so. He looked toward the road where the prison wagon had disappeared. There's still work ahead, you understand. Trial proceedings, restitution hearings, likely months of legal process before this is finally settled. I understand, Martha said. I've waited 40 years already, Sheriff. I expect I can manage a few more months. She rode home alone that night, Duke's steady gait carrying her through darkness that felt for the first time in weeks genuinely peaceful rather than threatening. Ash was waiting at the barn door, ears pricked toward the familiar sound, and Martha slid down from the saddle with a groan of pure exhaustion, crossing the yard to press her forehead against the mare's warm neck. It's done, girl, she whispered. Or near enough to done as makes no difference. He's in irons. The truth's finally outspreading through this whole valley, same as fire through dry grass. She pulled back, looking into Ash's clouded, sightless eyes, and felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally slip free. Your brand. That old forgotten mark burned into your shoulder, it brought my father home after 40 years, Ash. It gave a whole valley back its stolen truth. The mare huffed softly, leaning her head against Martha's shoulder in a gesture that had become over these past turbulent weeks, as familiar and comforting as anything Martha had known in years. Inside the house, Martha lit her single oil lamp and sat once more at her kitchen table. Her father's letter spread before her, worn now from countless readings, the edges soft from handling. We did it, Samuel, she said quietly, tracing her father's careful handwriting with one gentle finger. 40 years too late for you to see it, but we did it. Somewhere out past the ridge in a house that would soon stand empty, stripped of its stolen wealth, and returned piece by piece to the families it had been taken from, the silence that had protected Silas Crowder for 4 decades had finally completely, irrevocably broken. But Martha understood, even as relief and grief tangled together in her exhausted chest, that justice for the living was only half of what remained unfinished. Somewhere on that mountain, in unmarked ground, she had yet to find her father's body still waited 40 years. Buried 40 years, unclaimed. 40 years, without the proper rest, a man who'd died for the truth so thoroughly deserved. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it once more against her heart, and made herself a final quiet promise before she finally allowed her exhausted body the sleep it had been denied for days. I'm not finished yet, she whispered into the dark. Not until I bring you home." 3 days after Silas Crowder rode out of Caldwell Flats in irons, Martha stood once more at the edge of Split Rock Creek, this time with no fear driving her steps, no riders hunting her through the brush, only a shovel strapped across Duke's saddle and a promise burning steady in her chest. Ezra rode beside her, his arm finally free of its sling, though still stiff and careful, and Sheriff Whitcomb had insisted on sending 2 deputies along as well, though this time their presence felt like protection rather than threat. "You're certain this is the place?" Whitcomb asked, studying the worn map Martha had carried folded against her heart for 2 weeks now. "My father marked it himself," Martha said. "Shelter, he called it. But I don't think that word meant what I once thought it meant." They found the old line camp exactly where they'd found it before: the collapsed lean-to, the rusted coffee pot, the rock crevice that had hidden a rotted box for 40 years. But this time, Martha's eyes moved past the camp itself, toward the tree line beyond, toward a low rise of ground that Ezra had mentioned once almost in passing during their first desperate flight from Crowder's riders. "There," Ezra said quietly, pointing toward a cluster of stones arranged with a deliberateness that nature simply didn't produce on its own. "I remember now. 40 years, and I never once let myself think on it clear. But I remember Crowder's father's men working out this way back when I was young, and fool enough to still be riding fence for wages near this land." Martha's heart climbed into her throat as she dismounted and walked toward the stones, her legs unsteady beneath her, 40 years of grief and hope and dread, all tangled together in a knot she could barely breathe around. The stones formed a rough, unmarked rectangle, half sunken into the mountain soil moss, creeping across their weathered faces. "Here," Martha whispered. "He's here." They worked carefully, respectfully. Whitcomb's deputies taking turns with the shovel, while Martha knelt beside the grave, her hands pressed flat against the cool earth, murmuring words that belonged only to her and the father she'd waited 40 years to properly grieve. "I found you," she said softly. "Took me long enough, didn't it? But I found you." The digging took the better part of 2 hours, careful and slow, and when at last the shovel's edge revealed the pale curve of bone beneath the soil, one of the young deputies stepped back, his face gone pale, while Whitcomb removed his hat in solemn immediate respect. Martha didn't look away. She had spent 40 years imagining this moment in 1,000 different forms, and now that it had finally arrived, she found she owed her father the simple dignity of witnessing his return to the light, however difficult that witnessing proved to be. "Careful now," Ezra murmured to the deputies kneeling stiff beside the grave despite his healing wound. "Careful. This is Samuel Wren you're handling. Man deserves gentleness even now, especially now." They worked through the remainder of that difficult afternoon, uncovering what 40 years of mountain soil had kept hidden remains that told their own quiet, terrible story. A skull marked with clear evidence of violence that no accident or misfortune could explain away. Alongside the bones half preserved in a leather pouch that had somehow survived the decades. They found a pocket knife Martha recognized instantly, its handle carved with her father's initials, a gift she herself had given him the Christmas before he disappeared. She held that knife in her trembling hands and wept freely for the first time since this whole impossible journey had begun. 40 years of unshed grief, finally fully released beneath a Montana sky that had kept her father's secret for far too long. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said, pressing the knife against her heart. "I'm sorry, Papa. I'm so sorry." Ezra placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, saying nothing, simply standing beside her, in the particular wordless solidarity of 2 people who had both spent decades carrying grief they hadn't fully understood how to name. They brought Samuel Wren home to Caldwell Flats 3 days later, his remains carried with careful reverence in a simple pine box built by the town's own carpenter, who had refused payment the moment he understood whose bones he was building a coffin for. The whole valley turned out for the burial. Martha stood at the graveside in her best dark dress, the same one she'd worn to her husband's funeral years before, and found herself surrounded not by the mocking crowd that had once laughed at her single crumpled dollar, but by hundreds of neighbors, many of them strangers to her personally, yet bound together now by a shared decades-long wound finally beginning to heal. Ruth Henderson stood near the front, her hand resting on Martha's arm in quiet solidarity. The Ruiz family's eldest daughter, now grown with children of her own, had traveled 2 full days to attend, her eyes wet with tears, for a father she barely remembered losing her own family's land to the very conspiracy that had claimed Samuel Wren's life. Pastor Coombs spoke first, his voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. "We buried a mystery in this valley 40 years ago," he said. "Buried it in silence and fear, in the comfortable belief that some questions were simply too dangerous to ask out loud. Today, we bury a man instead. Samuel Wren, husband, father, honest rancher, and we now understand a man who gave his very life in pursuit of a truth this whole valley desperately needed." Martha stepped forward when the pastor finished her father's letter, folded in her coat pocket, close against her heart, where it had rested for weeks now. "My father wrote to me once," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady, despite the tears tracking silent down her face. "That truth alone is enough to move the world, even when the world seems determined to bury it. He believed that so completely, he gave his life defending it." She looked out over the gathered crowd, familiar faces and strangers alike, all of them, bound now by a shared history, finally brought into the light. "I used to think he'd simply vanished, wandered off into wild country, and never found his way home. I understand now that he never once stopped trying to come home. It just took 40 years and a dying blind horse. Nobody else wanted to finally bring him back to us." She knelt beside the grave as the pine box was lowered, placed a single wildflower atop it, the same variety her father used to pick for her mother during their long rides together. Decades before, grief and silence had settled permanently over this valley, and allowed herself at last the full and complete grief she had been carrying unacknowledged for 40 years. "Rest now, Papa," she whispered. "You did your part. I finished it for you. Rest now." Ash stood tethered nearby throughout the entire ceremony, brought along at Martha's own insistence, despite Ezra's gentle concern that a horse had no proper place at a human funeral. "She has every place here," Martha had told him firmly. "More right than most. If it weren't for her carrying that brand into a sale pen nobody else wanted to bid on, my father would still be lying unmarked and unclaimed on that mountain." After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed, and neighbors offered quiet condolences and quieter apologies for 40 years of assumptions they'd never once questioned, Martha led Ash to stand beside her father's fresh grave, one hand resting on the mare's scarred shoulder, directly over the brand that had started this entire impossible journey. "You brought him home," Martha murmured to the horse. "Whatever cruel road led you from his herd to that auction pen, you carried him home in the end. I don't reckon there's a way to properly thank a horse for something like that, but I intend to spend whatever years you've got left trying anyway." The mare huffed softly, leaning into Martha's touch, and Martha felt something settle deep in her chest. Not the sharp, desperate grief of the past weeks, but something quieter, steadier, the particular peace that comes only after a long-carried burden has finally fully been set down. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of legal proceedings that Martha found herself navigating with a stamina she hadn't known she still possessed at 62 years old. Marshall Grantham's investigators worked methodically through her father's ledger, cross-referencing every documented parcel against county records, building a restitution case that would eventually return stolen land to nearly 24 families across the valley. Ruth Henderson wept openly the day the land office confirmed her family's Eastern Range acreage would be returned in full, the paperwork corrected after 4 decades of fraudulent filing. "We can rebuild," she told Martha, gripping her hands with fierce, grateful strength. "My grandchildren can rebuild what my husband's family lost. Because of you, Martha. Because of your father's courage and yours." The Ruiz family's return proved more complicated. The original homestead had been sold twice more since Crowder's initial theft, tangled now in a web of subsequent buyers, who had in most cases purchased the land in good faith, unaware of its stolen origins. Martha spent long evenings at Reyes's temporary office in town, poring over documents with him as they worked to untangle each family's particular claim, determined that no family documented in her father's ledger would be left without some measure of justice, however complicated the path to achieving it proved. "This will take months yet," Reyes told her one exhausted evening, rubbing his ink-stained eyes. "Possibly years for some of the more tangled claims." "Then we'll spend months," Martha said. "Years if that's what it takes. I've waited 40 years already, Mr. Reyes. I can manage the patience required to see the rest of it through properly." Wag. Silas Crowder's trial began 6 weeks later, held in the territorial capital under heavy federal security, the proceedings drawing spectators from across the region, eager to witness the final reckoning of a man who had ruled the valley through fear and silence for 4 decades. Martha traveled to the capital for the trial, accompanied by Ezra Reyes and Sheriff Whitcomb. All 4 of them called to testify to different pieces of the sprawling case that had, piece by careful piece, dismantled Crowder's carefully constructed empire. She sat in the witness box on the second day of proceedings, her father's letter and the original ledger entered into evidence before her, and told the full story from beginning to end. The single crumpled dollar, the scarred brand on a dying mare's shoulder, the hidden map, the 40-year-old grave finally uncovered on a lonely mountainside. The prosecuting attorney, a sharp young woman named Miss Caroline Beaumont, sent by the Federal Land Office, guided Martha carefully through each piece of evidence, and Martha found herself, despite the exhaustion and grief still weighing heavy in her chest, speaking with a clarity and conviction that seemed to draw the entire courtroom into hushed, rapt attention. "Mrs. Wren," Beaumont said, "in your own words, what do you believe your father would want the court to understand about this case?" Martha considered the question a long moment, looking past the attorney to where Silas Crowder sat pale and diminished, now stripped of the fine suits and confident bearing that had once made him the most feared man in 3 counties. "My father believed truth mattered," she said finally, her voice carrying clear across the silent courtroom. "Believed it enough to give his life for it 40 years ago on a mountain most folks in this valley were too frightened to even name out loud. I think he'd want this court to understand that silence isn't safety. It's just delay. Sooner or later, buried truth finds its way back to the surface. Sometimes it just takes $1 and a dying horse and an old woman too stubborn to stop asking questions." A murmur rippled through the gallery, and even the presiding judge, a stern man who had shown little emotion throughout the proceedings, seemed to pause a moment longer than necessary before calling for the next witness. The trial stretched across nearly 3 weeks, witness after witness building an overwhelming, irrefutable case against Silas Crowder. Eleanor Crowder's testimony regarding her husband's private safe and the damning correspondence within it, the confessions of the 2 men captured at the Southern Crossing. Reyes's meticulous financial analysis laid out chart by chart before the jury, and finally, devastatingly, the forensic evidence recovered from Samuel Wren's grave itself, confirming beyond any reasonable doubt the violence that had ended his life 4 decades before. Crowder's own defense attorney attempted in the trial's final days to argue that whatever crimes had occurred belonged properly to Crowder's late father, that Silas himself had simply inherited an empire without full knowledge of its foundations. The argument collapsed entirely under the weight of Eleanor Crowder's testimony, delivered with quiet, devastating precision on the trial's 12th day. "My husband knew," she told the courtroom, her voice steady, despite the visible toll 35 years of marriage to the man now sitting in shackles had taken on her. "He knew from the earliest days of our marriage. I overheard conversations I told myself I misunderstood, saw documents I told myself weren't what they appeared to be. I chose comfortable ignorance for 35 years, and I will carry that shame for whatever years remain to me." She looked directly at Silas Crowder, her composure never once wavering. "But my husband was never ignorant. He simply calculated every single day for 35 years that his wealth and power made him untouchable. I am here today to make certain that calculation was wrong." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Martha stood in the crowded courtroom as the verdict was read, her hand gripped tight in Ezra's Reyes, and Whitcomb standing close beside her, and felt the full, overwhelming weight of 40 years finally completely lift from her shoulders as the foreman's voice rang out clear and final. "Guilty, on every count, land fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and murder." Silas Crowder showed no visible reaction as the verdict was announced. His face carved into the same careful, controlled composure he'd worn throughout the entire proceedings. Though Martha thought she saw in the brief moment before the deputies led him away, something finally cracked behind those cold, calculating eyes. Not remorse, she suspected, but simple, bitter disbelief that the empire he'd spent a lifetime protecting through silence and violence had ultimately been undone by a woman with a single crumpled dollar and a dying blind horse. "It's over," Ezra murmured beside her, his voice thick with 40 years of relief finally released. "Martha, it's truly over." Martha closed her eyes, felt tears she'd been holding back throughout the entire trial finally spill free, and allowed herself for one long, unguarded moment to simply feel the full magnitude of what had finally been accomplished. "Not entirely over," she said, opening her eyes, something steady and certain settling behind them. "There's still restitution to see through, still families waiting on land that's rightfully theirs. But this part is finished." The sentencing came 3 days later. Silas Crowder was ordered to forfeit his entire ranch holdings, nearly 80,000 acres accumulated across 4 decades of fraud, with the land to be distributed through federal restitution proceedings to the documented families whose ownership had been stolen. He was further sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Samuel Wren, a sentence the judge delivered with unusual pointed severity. "You built an empire on other men's graves," the judge told him, "and you maintained it through 4 decades of fear, believing your wealth placed you beyond the reach of justice. Today, this court proves that belief was always fundamentally wrong." Martha did not attend the sentencing itself, choosing instead to remain in Caldwell Flats, tending to ash, and beginning at long last the slow process of returning to something resembling ordinary life. Word reached her by telegraph the same evening, delivered personally by Sheriff Whitcomb, who rode out to her small spread despite the late hour. "Life imprisonment," he told her, standing in her yard beneath a sky just beginning to darken toward evening. "Land forfeiture in full. Restitution proceedings already underway." Martha absorbed the news standing beside Ash's stall, one hand resting on the mare's scarred shoulder, and found that the moment carried less triumph than she'd expected, and more simply, a profound, exhausted peace. "He'll spend the rest of his life exactly where he put my father," she said quietly, "buried, just without the mercy of an ending." "Some might call that poetic," Whitcomb offered. "Some might," Martha agreed. "I call it 40 years too late, but justice all the same." The restitution proceedings unfolded slowly across the following months, each family's claim requiring careful documentation, careful verification, careful negotiation with subsequent landowners who had in many cases purchased Crowder's stolen parcels without any knowledge of their fraudulent origins. Martha found herself deeply involved in nearly every case, her father's ledger serving as the foundational evidence for claim after claim, her own testimony required repeatedly as the legal machinery ground slowly, steadily forward. Ruth Henderson's family received their Eastern Range acreage back in full within the first month, the earliest and cleanest of the restitution cases. Martha stood beside her the day the deed was formally transferred, watching decades of quiet grief transform at last into something resembling hope. "My grandchildren will grow up on this land," Ruth told her, tears streaming freely down her weathered face. "Same as their great-grandfather intended before it was stolen from beneath him. Because of you, Martha, because you refused to let a dollar and a dying horse be the end of the story." The Ruiz family's claim proved more complicated, tangled through multiple subsequent sales, but by the 4th month, federal negotiators had secured a settlement that returned a significant portion of the original homestead, along with fair compensation for the remainder, allowing the family to rebuild on ground that had once belonged to their grandparents. One by one, family by family, the ledger's damning pages transformed from evidence of theft into instruments of restoration, each restitution a small, hard-won victory against 40 years of buried silence. Ezra recovered fully from his gunshot wound by late summer, though he walked afterward with a slight stiffness in that shoulder that Martha suspected would never entirely leave him. He took to visiting her small spread regularly, ostensibly to check on Ash's continued recovery. Though Martha had come to understand over the months of shared danger and shared grief that his visits carried a warmth that went considerably deeper than simple concern for a horse's health. "She's doing well," Ezra observed one warm evening, watching as Ash grazed contentedly in the small paddock Martha had built for her. Her blindness no longer the fragile dying weakness it had been at that dusty summer auction months before, but simply one more part of an animal who had, against every expectation, thrived. "Never would have guessed watching her stumble off that auction block that she'd end up looking this healthy." "She had good reason to fight for it," Martha said. "Same reason I did, I suppose." Ezra was quiet a moment, watching the mare with an expression Martha had come to recognize as particular to him, thoughtful, careful, weighing words before he spoke them. 40 years I told myself I was too old, too ordinary, too much a coward to matter to anything bigger than my own small life," he said finally. "This past summer taught me different." He looked at Martha, something gentle and hopeful in his weathered face. "I don't reckon I've got a great many years left, Martha. But I find I'd like to spend whatever's left of them somewhere near you if you'd have that." Martha felt something's in her chest, long closed off since her husband's death years before, crack open slowly, carefully into something that felt dangerously close to new hope. "I'd have that Ezra Combs," she said. "I believe I would." By autumn, Reyes had relocated his accounting practice permanently to Caldwell Flats, finding steady work, helping the dozens of restitution cases still winding their way through federal proceedings, and Sheriff Whitcomb, having spent 15 years complicit in Crowder's silence, dedicated himself with fierce redemptive energy to ensuring no similar corruption could ever again take root in the valley he'd sworn to protect. Eleanor Crowder did not remain in the territory. Having finalized her separation and testified fully at trial, she departed for the eastern states before the first snowfall, carrying with her a portion of her own inherited wealth entirely separate from her husband's stolen fortune, determined to build some new, honest chapter of life, far from the valley that had witnessed her 35 years of comfortable, complicit silence. Martha received one final letter from her before her departure, brief but heartfelt, thanking Martha for the courage that had finally allowed Eleanor to break free of a silence she'd carried far too long herself. "You reminded me," the letter read, "that it is never too late to choose truth over comfort, however many years have passed. I am grateful more than words can properly express for that reminder." Martha kept the letter alongside her father's own 2 testaments to the same hard, necessary lesson that truth, however long buried, however dangerous to uncover, was always worth the fight required to bring it home. The first anniversary of that fateful auction arrived on a clear, crisp Montana morning, and Martha found herself once more at the edge of Caldwell Flats town square, standing near the very spot where she'd once stood, with a single crumpled dollar clutched in her trembling hand, while a crowd of neighbors laughed at her foolishness. The square looked different now. A small memorial had been erected near the courthouse steps, modest, unassuming, but permanent, honoring Samuel Wren, and the truth he'd died protecting, funded not by any government proceeding, but by the quiet, grateful contributions of dozens of families whose stolen land had finally, after 40 long years, been returned to their rightful hands. Martha stood before the memorial, with Ash beside her. The mare fully recovered, now her coat gleaming silver gray in the morning light, her blindness no longer a mark of pity, but simply quietly a part of who she was, the horse who had carried a murdered man's brand out of obscurity, and in doing so, carried an entire valley's buried truth back into the light. 1 year, Martha murmured, resting her hand against the mare's familiar shoulder, tracing the old scarred brand that had started this entire impossible journey. 1 year since I paid a single dollar for a dying horse nobody else wanted and found my father's name burned into her shoulder instead. Ezra approached from across the square, his stride steadier now than it had been in the difficult months following his injury, and slipped his hand into Martha's with the easy familiarity of a man who had over the past year become something far more permanent in her life than simple friendship. "Quite a year, wasn't it?" he said. "Quite a year. Martha agreed. They stood together a long moment, watching the town square fill slowly with neighbors gathering for the small commemorative ceremony Pastor Coombs had organized to mark both Samuel Wren's memory and the broader restoration the whole valley had undergone in the months since his grave had finally been uncovered. Ruth Henderson's grandchildren played nearby, laughing freely on land that once again rightfully belonged to their family. The Ruiz family's eldest daughter stood with her own children near the courthouse steps, having traveled once more from her distant home to honor the anniversary of a truth that had finally set her family's history straight. Reyes arrived with a stack of papers under his arm. The final restitution case, a small homestead near the northern boundary, the last family documented in Samuel Wren's ledger, still awaiting their rightful return, nearly complete, after nearly a full year of careful, methodical work. "Last one," he told Martha, a tired but satisfied smile crossing his ink-stained face. "The Coleman family. Papers finalized next week. Every family your father documented, Martha, will finally have what was stolen from them restored." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. 40 years of grief and 1 full year of relentless, exhausting fight, finally completely reaching their conclusion. "He'd be proud," she said quietly, "of all of you, of everyone who helped carry this truth the distance it needed to travel. He'd be proudest of you." Ezra said gently, "Never forget that, Martha. None of this happens without you standing firm at that auction, paying a single dollar for a horse nobody else wanted." Sheriff Whitcomb joined them as the ceremony began, standing solemn and respectful before the small memorial. His 15 years of complicit silence transformed over the past year into fierce, dedicated service to the valley he'd once failed so thoroughly to protect. "1 year ago," he told the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clear across the quiet square, "most of us in this valley believed Samuel Wren's disappearance was simply one more sad mystery swallowed by wild mountain country and left unsolved. We were wrong, and I include myself most particularly in that wrongness, having spent 15 years serving as this valley's sheriff while looking away from truths I should have pursued far sooner." He looked toward Martha, standing beside Ash at the edge of the crowd. "It took one woman's courage and one blind horse's unlikely journey to finally bring that buried truth into the light. Samuel Wren's name has been restored. His killer sits in federal prison, stripped of the empire he built on murder and silence. And nearly every family whose land was stolen across 4 decades of fraud has now had that theft corrected, their rightful inheritance restored." His voice grew thick with emotion. "We owe Martha Wren, and we owe her father, a debt this valley will carry with gratitude for generations to come." The crowd's applause swelled warm and genuine across the square, and Martha, standing beside the mayor who had carried her father's brand out of 40 years of darkness, felt the full, overwhelming weight of the moment settle deep into her chest. Not simply pride, though pride was certainly present, but something deeper, something closer to peace. That evening, after the ceremony had concluded and the crowd had slowly dispersed back to homes and land, finally rightfully restored, Martha walked alone with Ash along the familiar path toward her small spread, the mare's steady, confident gait, a far cry from the trembling, dying creature she'd purchased for a single crumpled dollar exactly 1 year before. She stopped at the edge of her property, where the trail crested a small rise, offering a clear view of the mountains beyond, the same mountains that had swallowed her father for 40 long years. The same mountains that had finally, painfully given him back. "We did it, Papa," she said softly, resting her hand once more against Ash's scarred shoulder. "Took a dollar, a dying horse, and a whole year of fighting harder than I ever believed myself capable of. But we did it. Every family made whole. Every stolen truth brought home." The wind carried her words up toward the darkening ridge, and Martha stood there a long while, feeling the particular hard-won peace of a promise finally completely fulfilled. She thought of that first terrible day at the auction, the mocking laughter, the single crumpled dollar, the dying mare nobody else wanted, and marveled at how completely that single small act of stubborn compassion had unraveled 40 years of buried violence, restored an entire valley's stolen history, and brought a murdered man finally, properly home to rest. She thought of her mother, who had spent decades staring silently out a kitchen window, waiting on a truth she never lived to see uncovered, and hoped with everything left in her weary heart that some part of her mother's spirit had witnessed this final complete justice from wherever grief eventually leads the faithful. And she thought of Ash, blind, dying, worthless to every eye but her own, on that dusty summer day, and understood now with complete and unshakable certainty that some of the most important truths in this world arrive wearing the most unlikely, unwanted forms, waiting only for someone brave enough, stubborn enough to look past the surface and recognize what they truly carry. "Come on, girl," Martha said, finally turning back toward home as the last light faded gold behind the ridge. "Ezra's got supper waiting, and I imagine Reyes will want to celebrate proper once he finishes with those last papers." Ash followed her, steady and sure, along the familiar path, no longer stumbling, no longer fragile, simply walking home beside the woman who had once paid a single dollar to save her, and who had in the saving found her own long-buried truth finally completely restored. Samuel Wren's name would be remembered now not as a mystery swallowed by wild country, but as a man who gave his life defending honest truth against 40 years of powerful, entrenched silence. His daughter had finished what he started, carrying his fight the final distance he himself never got the chance to travel. And in a Montana valley, once ruled by fear and buried lies, an old woman, a blind horse, and a truth nobody else had the courage to see, had together accomplished what 40 years of silence had failed to prevent justice complete and undeniable finally fully come home.